Welcome to the channel. Today's audiobook is an apology for idlers by Robert Louis Stevenson, first published in 1877. This work is presented for historical and educational purposes and reflects the ideas and context of its time. If you enjoy classic literature, history, and political thought in audiobook form, consider subscribing. Now, let's begin. Robert Louis Stevenson. An apology for idlers Boswell. We grow weary when idle. Johnson. That is, sir, because others being busy, we want company. But if we were idle, there would be no growing weary. We should all entertain one another. Just now, when everyone is bound under pain of a decree in absence convicting them of less respectability to enter on some lucrative profession and labor therein with something not far short of enthusiasm, a cry from the opposite party, who are content when they have enough and like to look on and enjoy in the meanwhile, savors a little of bravado and gasconade, and yet this should not be idleness so called, which does not consist in doing nothing, but in doing a great deal not recognized in the dogmatic formularies of the ruling class, has as good a right to state its position as industry itself. It is admitted that the presence of people who refuse to enter in the great handicap race for sixpenny pieces is at once an insult and a disenchantment for those who do. A fine fellow, as we see so many, takes his determination, votes for the sixpences, and in the emphatic Americanism, goes for them. And while such an one is ploughing distressfully up the road, it is not hard to understand his resentment when he perceives cool persons in the meadows by the wayside lying with a handkerchief over their ears and a glass at their elbow. Alexander is touched in a very delicate place by the disregard of Diogenes. Where was the glory of having taken Rome for these tumultuous barbarians who poured into the Senate house and found the fathers sitting silent and unmoved by their success? It is a sore thing to have labored along and scaled the arduous hilltops, and when all is done, find humanity indifferent to your achievement. Hence physicists condemn the unphysical. Financiers have only a superficial toleration for those who know little of stocks. Literary persons despise the unlettered, and people of all pursuits combine to disparage those who have none. But though this is one difficulty of the subject, it is not the greatest. You could not be put in prison for speaking against industry, but you can be sent to Coventry for speaking like a fool. The greatest difficulty with most subjects is to do them well. Therefore, please to remember this is an apology. It is certain that much may be judiciously argued in favor of diligence, only there is something to be said against it, and that is what on the present occasion I have to say. To state one argument is not necessarily to be deaf to all others, and that a man has written a book of travels in Montenegro is no reason why he should never have been to Richmond. It is surely beyond a doubt that people should be a good deal idle in youth. For though here and there a Lord Macaulay may escape from school honours, with all his wits about him, most boys pay so dear for their medals that they never afterwards have a shot in their locker and begin the world bankrupt. And the same holds true during all the time a lad is educating himself or suffering others to educate him. It must have been a very foolish old gentleman who addressed Johnson at Oxford in these words: "Young man, ply your book diligently now and acquire a stock of knowledge. For when years come upon you, you will find that poring upon books will be but an irksome task." The old gentleman seems to have been unaware that many other things besides reading grow irksome, and not a few become impossible by the time a man has to use spectacles and cannot walk without a stick. Books are good enough in their own way, but they are a mighty bloodless substitute for life. It seems a pity to sit, like the Lady of Shalott, peering into a mirror with your back turned on all the bustle and glamour of reality. And if a man reads very hard, as the old anecdote reminds us, he will have little time for thought. If you look back on your own education, I'm sure it will not be the full, vivid, instructive hours of truantry that you regret. You would rather cancel some lackluster periods between sleep and waking in the class. For my own part, I have attended a good many lectures in my time. I still remember that the spinning of a top is a case of kinetic stability. I still remember that Emphytius is not a disease, nor stillicide a crime. But though I would not willingly part with such scraps of science, I do not set the same store by them as by certain other odds and ends that I came by in the open street while I was playing truant. This is not the moment to dilate on that mighty place of education, which was the favorite school of Dickens and of Balzac, and turns out yearly many inglorious masters in the science of the aspects of life. Suffice it to say this: if a lad does not learn in the streets, it is because he has no faculty of learning. nor is the truant always in the streets, for if he prefers, he may go out by the garden suburbs into the country. He may pitch on some tuft of lilacs over a burn, and smoke innumerable pipes to the tune of the water on the stones. A bird will sing in the thicket, and there he may fall into a vein of kindly thought and see things in a new perspective. Why, if this be not education, what is... We may conceive Mr. Worldly Wiseman accosting such an one, and the conversation that should thereupon ensue. How now, young fellow, what dost thou here? Truly, sir, I take mine ease. Is not this the hour of the class, and shouldst thou not be plying thy book with diligence, to the end thou mayest obtain knowledge? Nay, but thus also I follow after learning, by your leave. Learning, quotha, after what fashion, I pray thee? Is it mathematics? No, to be sure. Is it metaphysics? Nor that. Is it some language? Nay, it is no language. Is it a trade? Nor a trade neither. Why, then, what is't? Indeed, sir, as a time may soon come for me to go upon pilgrimage, I am desirous to note what is commonly done by persons in my case, and where are the ugliest sloughs and thickets on the road, as also what manner of staff is of the best service. Moreover, I lie here by this water to learn by root of heart a lesson, which my master teaches me to call peace or contentment. Hereupon Mr. Worldly Wiseman was much commoved with passion, and shaking his cane with a very threatful countenance, broke forth upon this wise. Learning, quotha, said he, I would have all such rogues scourged by the hangman. And so he would go his way, ruffling out his cravat with a crackle of starch, like a turkey when it spread its feathers. Now this of Mr. Wiseman's is the common opinion. A fact is not called a fact, but a piece of gossip, if it does not fall into one of your scholastic categories. An inquiry must be in some acknowledged direction, with a name to go by, or else you are not inquiring at all, only lounging, and the workhouse is too good for you. It is supposed that all knowledge is at the bottom of a well, or the far end of a telescope. Saint Beuve, as he grew older, came to regard all experience as a single great book, in which to study for a few years ere we go hence, and it seemed all one to him whether you should read in chapter XX, which is the differential calculus, or in chapter XX x to x, which is hearing the band play in the gardens. As a matter of fact, an intelligent person, looking out of his eyes and hearkening in his ears, with a smile on his face all the time, will get more true education than many another in a life of heroic vigils. There is certainly some chill and arid knowledge to be found upon the summits of formal and laborious science, but it is all round about you, and for the trouble of looking, that you will acquire the warm and palpitating facts of life, while others are filling their memory with a lumber of words, one half of which they will forget before the week be out. Your truant may learn some really useful art, to play the fiddle, to know a good cigar, or to speak with ease and opportunity to all varieties of men. Many who have plied their book diligently and know all about some one branch or another of accepted lore, come out of the study with an ancient and owl-like demeanor, and prove dry, stockish, and dyspeptic in all the better and brighter parts of life. Many make a large fortune who remain underbred and pathetically stupid to the last. And meantime there goes the idler who began life along with them, by your leave a different picture. He has had time to take care of his health and his spirits. He has been a great deal in the open air, which is the most salutary of all things for both body and mind, and if he has never read the great book in very recondite places, he has dipped into it and skimmed it over to excellent purpose. Might not the student afford some Hebrew roots, and the businessman some of his half-crowns for a share of the idler's knowledge of life at large and art of living? Nay, and the idler has another and more important quality than these, I mean his wisdom. He who has much looked on at the childish satisfaction of other people in their hobbies will regard his own with only a very ironical indulgence. He will not be heard among the dogmatists. He will have a great and cool allowance for all sorts of people and opinions. If he finds no out-of-the-way truths, he will identify himself with no very burning falsehood. His way takes him along a by-road not much frequented, but very even and pleasant, which is called Commonplace Lane, and leads to the belvedere of common sense. Thence he shall command an agreeable, if no very noble prospect, and while others behold the east and west, the devil and the sunrise, he will be contentedly aware of a sort of morning hour upon all sublunary things, with an army of shadows running speedily and in many different directions into the great daylight of eternity. The shadows and the generations, the shrill doctors and the plangent wars, go by into ultimate silence and emptiness, but underneath all this a man may see out of the Belvedere windows much green and peaceful landscape, many firelit parlors, good people laughing, drinking, and making love as they did before the flood or the French Revolution, and the old shepherd telling his tale under the hawthorn. Extreme busyness, whether at school or college, kirk or market, is a symptom of deficient vitality, and a faculty for idleness implies a catholic appetite and a strong sense of personal identity. There is a sort of dead, alive, hackneyed people about who are scarcely conscious of living except in the exercise of some conventional occupation. Bring these fellows into the country or set them aboard ship, and you will see how they pine for their desk or their study. They have no curiosity, they cannot give themselves over to random provocations, they do not take pleasure in the exercise of their faculties for its own sake, and unless necessity lays about them with a stick, they will even stand still. It is no good speaking to such folk, they cannot be idle, their nature is not generous enough, and they pass those hours in a sort of coma, which are not dedicated to furious moiling in the gold mill, when they do not require to go to the office, when they are not hungry and have no mind to drink. The whole breathing world is a blank to them. If they have to wait an hour or so for a train, they fall into a stupid trance with their eyes open. To see them, you would suppose there was nothing to look at and no one to speak with. You would imagine they were paralyzed or alienated, and yet very possibly they are hard workers in their own way, and have good eyesight for a flaw in a deed or a turn of the market. They have been to school and college, but all the time they had their eye on the medal. They have gone about in the world and mixed with clever people, but all the time they were thinking of their own affairs, as if a man's soul were not too small to begin with. They have dwarfed and narrowed theirs by a life of all work and no play, until here they are at 40, with a listless attention, a mind vacant of all material of amusement, and not one thought to rub against another while they wait for the train. Before he was breeched he might have clambered on the boxes. When he was 20 he would have stared at the girls. But now the pipe is smoked out, the snuff-box empty, and my gentleman sits bolt upright upon a bench with lamentable eyes. This does not appeal to me as being success in life. But it is not only the person himself who suffers from his busy habits, but his wife and children, his friends and relations, and down to the very people he sits with in a railway carriage or an omnibus. Perpetual devotion to what a man calls his business is only to be sustained by perpetual neglect of many other things, and it is not by any means certain that a man's business is the most important thing he has to do. To an impartial estimate, it will seem clear that many of the wisest, most virtuous, and most beneficent parts that are to be played upon the theatre of life are filled by gratuitous performers and pass among the world at large as phases of idleness. For in that theatre, not only the walking gentlemen, singing chambermaids, and diligent fiddlers in the orchestra, but those who look on and clap their hands from the benches, do really play a part and fulfill important offices towards the general result. You are no doubt very dependent on the care of your lawyer and stockbroker, of the guards and signalmen who convey you rapidly from place to place, and the policemen who walk the streets for your protection, but is there not a thought of gratitude in your heart for certain other benefactors who set you smiling when they fall in your way, or season your dinner with good company? Colonel Newcome helped to lose his friend's money. Fred Bayham had an ugly trick of borrowing shirts, and yet they were better people to fall among than Mr. Barnes. And though Falstaff was neither sober nor very honest, I think I could name one or two long-faced Barabbases whom the world could better have done without. Hazlitt mentions that he was more sensible of obligation to Northcote, who had never done him anything he could call a service, than to his whole circle of ostentatious friends, for he thought a good companion emphatically the greatest benefactor. I know there are people in the world who cannot feel grateful unless the favour has been done them at the cost of pain and difficulty, but this is a churlish disposition. A man may send you 6 sheets of letter paper covered with the most entertaining gossip, or you may pass half an hour pleasantly, perhaps profitably, over an article of his. Do you think the service would be greater if he had made the manuscript in his heart's blood, like a compact with the devil? Do you really fancy you should be more beholden to your correspondent if he had been damning you all the while for your importunity? Pleasures are more beneficial than duties, because, like the quality of mercy, they are not strained, and they are twice blessed. There must always be 2 to a kiss, and there may be a score in a jest, but wherever there is an element of sacrifice, the favour is conferred with pain, and among generous people received with confusion. There is no duty we so much underrate as the duty of being happy. By being happy, we sow anonymous benefits upon the world, which remain unknown even to ourselves or when they are disclosed. Surprise nobody so much as the benefactor. The other day, a ragged barefoot boy ran down the street after a marble, with so jolly an air that he set everyone he passed into a good humor. One of these persons, who had been delivered from more than usually black thoughts, stopped the little fellow and gave him some money with this remark: "You see what sometimes comes of looking pleased." If he had looked pleased before, he had now to look both pleased and mystified. For my part, I justify this encouragement of smiling rather than tearful children. I do not wish to pay for tears anywhere but upon the stage, but I am prepared to deal largely in the opposite commodity. A happy man or woman is a better thing to find than a £5 note. He or she is a radiating focus of goodwill, and their entrance into a room is as though another candle had been lighted. We need not care whether they could prove the 47th proposition. They do a better thing than that. They practically demonstrate the great theorem of the livableness of life. Consequently, if a person cannot be happy without remaining idle, idle he should remain. It is a revolutionary precept, but thanks to hunger and the workhouse, one not easily to be abused, and within practical limits it is one of the most incontestable truths in the whole body of morality. Look at one of your industrious fellows for a moment, I beseech you. He sows hurry and reaps indigestion. He puts a vast deal of activity out to interest and receives a large measure of nervous derangement in return. Either he absents himself entirely from all fellowship and lives a recluse in a garret, with carpet slippers and a leaden inkpot, or he comes among people swiftly and bitterly, in a contraction of his whole nervous system, to discharge some temper before he returns to work. I do not care how much or how well he works. This fellow is an evil feature in other people's lives. They would be happier if he were dead. They could easier do without his services in the circumlocution office than they can tolerate his fractious spirits. He poisons life at the wellhead. It is better to be beggared out of hand by a scapegrace nephew than daily hag-ridden by a peevish uncle. And what in God's name is all this pother about? For what cause do they embitter their own and other people's lives? That a man should publish 30 or 40 articles a year, that he should finish or not finish his great allegorical picture, are questions of little interest to the world. The ranks of life are full, and although 1,000 fall, there are always some to go into the breach. When they told Joan of Arc she should be at home minding women's work, she answered there were plenty to spin and wash. And so, even with your own rare gifts, when nature is so careless of the single life, why should we coddle ourselves into the fancy that our own is of exceptional importance? Suppose Shakespeare had been knocked on the head some dark night in Sir Thomas Lucy's preserves. The world would have wagged on better or worse, the pitcher gone to the well, the scythe to the corn, and the student to his book, and no one been any the wiser of the loss. There are not many works extant, if you look the alternative all over, which are worth the price of a pound of tobacco to a man of limited means. This is a sobering reflection for the proudest of our earthly vanities. Even a tobacconist may, upon consideration, find no great cause for personal vainglory in the phrase, for although tobacco is an admirable sedative, the qualities necessary for retailing it are neither rare nor precious in themselves. Alas and alas, you may take it how you will, but the services of no single individual are indispensable. Atlas was just a gentleman with a protracted nightmare. And yet you see merchants who go and labour themselves into a great fortune, and thence into the bankruptcy court. Scribblers who keep scribbling at little articles until their temper is across to all who come about them, as though Pharaoh should set the Israelites to make a pin instead of a pyramid, and fine young men who work themselves into a decline, and are driven off in a hearse with white plumes upon it. Would you not suppose these persons had been whispered by the master of the ceremonies the promise of some momentous destiny, and that this lukewarm bullet on which they play their farces was the bull's-eye and centre point of all the universe? And yet it is not so. The ends for which they give away their priceless youth, for all they know, may be chimerical or hurtful. The glory and riches they expect may never come, or may find them indifferent, and they and the world they inhabit are so inconsiderable that the mind freezes at the thought. Letter to a young gentleman who proposes to embrace the career of art. With the agreeable frankness of youth, you address me on a point of some practical importance to yourself, and it is even conceivable of some gravity to the world. Should you or should you not become an artist? It is one which you must decide entirely for yourself. All that I can do is to bring under your notice some of the materials of that decision, and I will begin, as I shall probably conclude also, by assuring you that all depends on the vocation. To know what you like is the beginning of wisdom and of old age. Youth is wholly experimental. The essence and charm of that unquiet and delightful epoch is ignorance of self as well as ignorance of life. These two unknowns the young man brings together again and again, now in the airiest touch, now with a bitter hug, now with exquisite pleasure, now with cutting pain, but never with indifference to which he is a total stranger, and never with that near kinsman of indifference, contentment. If he be a youth of dainty senses, or a brain easily heated, the interest of this series of experiments grows upon him out of all proportion to the pleasure he receives. It is not beauty that he loves, nor pleasure that he seeks, though he may think so. His design and his sufficient reward is to verify his own existence and taste the variety of human fate. To him, before the razor edge of curiosity is dulled, all that is not actual living and the hot chase of experience wears a face of a disgusting dryness, difficult to recall in later days, or if there be any exception. And here destiny steps in. It is in those moments when, wearied or surfeited of the primary activity of the senses, he calls up before memory the image of transacted pains and pleasures. Thus it is that such an one shies from all cut-and-dried professions and inclines insensibly toward that career of art which consists only in the tasting and recording of experience. This, which is not so much a vocation for art as an impatience of all other honest trades, frequently exists alone, and so existing it will pass gently away in the course of years. Emphatically it is not to be regarded, it is not a vocation but a temptation, and when your father the other day so fiercely and in my view so properly discouraged your ambition, he was recalling not improbably some similar passage in his own experience, for the temptation is perhaps nearly as common as the vocation is rare. But again we have vocations which are imperfect, we have men whose minds are bound up, not so much in any art as in the general ars artium and common base of all creative work, who will now dip into painting and now study counterpoint, and anon will be inditing a sonnet, all these with equal interest, all often with genuine knowledge. And of this temper when it stands alone I find it difficult to speak, but I should counsel such an one to take to letters, for in literature, which drags with so wide a net, all his information may be found some day useful, and if he should go on as he has begun, and turn at last into the critic, he will have learned to use the necessary tools. Lastly, we come to those vocations which are at once decisive and precise, to the men who are born with the love of pigments, the passion of drawing, the gift of music, or the impulse to create with words, just as other, and perhaps the same men are born with the love of hunting, or the sea, or horses, or the turning lathe. These are predestined. If a man love the labour of any trade, apart from any question of success or fame, the gods have called him. He may have the general vocation too, he may have a taste for all the arts, and I think he often has, but the mark of his calling is this laborious partiality for one, this inextinguishable zest in its technical successes, and perhaps above all a certain candour of mind, to take his very trifling enterprise with a gravity that would befit the cares of empire, and to think the smallest improvement worth accomplishing at any expense of time and industry. The book, the statue, the sonata must be gone upon with the unreasoning good faith and the unflagging spirit of children at their play. Is it worth doing? When it shall have occurred to any artist to ask himself that question, it is implicitly answered in the negative. It does not occur to the child as he plays at being a pirate on the dining-room sofa, nor to the hunter as he pursues his quarry. And the candour of the one and the ardour of the other should be united in the bosom of the artist. If you recognize in yourself some such decisive taste, there is no room for hesitation. Follow your bent, and observe, lest I should too much discourage you, that the disposition does not usually burn so brightly at the first, or rather not so constantly. Habit and practice sharpen gifts. The necessity of toil grows less disgusting, grows even welcome, in the course of years. A small taste, if it be only genuine, waxes with indulgence into an exclusive passion. Enough just now, if you can look back over a fair interval, and see that your chosen art has a little more than held its own among the thronging interests of youth. Time will do the rest, if devotion help it, and soon your every thought will be engrossed in that beloved occupation. But even with devotion, you may remind me, even with unfaltering and delighted industry, Many thousand artists spend their lives, if the result be regarded utterly in vain, 1,000 artists and never one work of art. But the vast mass of mankind are incapable of doing anything reasonably well, art among the rest. The worthless artist would not improbably have been a quite incompetent baker, and the artist, even if he does not amuse the public, amuses himself, so that there will always be one man the happier for his vigils. This is the practical side of art, its inexpugnable fortress for the true practitioner. The direct returns, the wages of the trade, are small, but the indirect, the wages of the life, are incalculably great. No other business offers a man his daily bread upon such joyful terms. The soldier and the explorer have moments of a worthier excitement, but they are purchased by cruel hardships and periods of tedium that beggar language. In the life of the artist there need be no hour without its pleasure. I take the author with whose career I am best acquainted, and it is true he works in a rebellious material, and that the act of writing is cramped and trying both to the eyes and the temper. But remark him in his study, when matter crowds upon him and words are not wanting, in what a continual series of small successes time flows by, with what a sense of power as of one moving mountains. He marshals his petty characters, with what pleasures both of the ear and eye. He sees his airy structure growing on the page, and how he labors in a craft to which the whole material of his life is tributary, and which opens a door to all his tastes, his loves, his hatreds, and his convictions, so that what he writes is only what he longed to utter. He may have enjoyed many things in this big, tragic playground of the world, but what shall he have enjoyed more fully than a morning of successful work, suppose it ill paid? The wonder is it should be paid at all. Other men pay, and pay dearly, for pleasures less desirable. Nor will the practice of art afford you pleasure only. It affords besides an admirable training. For the artist works entirely upon honor. The public knows little or nothing of those merits, in the quest of which you are condemned to spend the bulk of your endeavors. Merits of design, the merit of first-hand energy, the merit of a certain cheap accomplishment which a man of the artistic temper easily acquires. These they can recognize, and these they value. But to those more exquisite refinements of proficiency and finish, which the artist so ardently desires and so keenly feels, for which, in the vigorous words of Balzac, he must toil like a miner buried in a landslip, for which day after day he recasts and revises and rejects, the gross mass of the public must be ever blind. To those lost pains, suppose you attain the highest pitch of merit, posterity may possibly do justice. Suppose, as is so probable, you fail by even a hair's breadth of the highest, rest certain they shall never be observed. Under the shadow of this cold thought, alone in his studio, the artist must preserve from day to day his constancy to the ideal. It is this which makes his life noble. It is by this that the practice of his craft strengthens and matures his character. It is for this that even the serious countenance of the great emperor was turned approvingly, if only for a moment, on the followers of Apollo, and that sternly gentle voice bade the artist cherish his art. And here there fall two warnings to be made. First, if you are to continue to be a law to yourself, you must beware of the first signs of laziness. This idealism in honesty can only be supported by perpetual effort. The standard is easily lowered. The artist who says it will do is on the downward path. 3 or 4 pot boilers are enough at times, above all at wrong times, to falsify a talent, and by the practice of journalism a man runs the risk of becoming wedded to cheap finish. This is the danger on the one side. There is not less upon the other. The consciousness of how much the artist is and must be a law to himself debauches the small heads. Perceiving recondite merits very hard to attain, making or swallowing artistic formulae, or perhaps falling in love with some particular proficiency of his own, many artists forget the end of all art. To please. It is doubtless tempting to exclaim against the ignorant bourgeois, yet it should not be forgotten, it is he who is to pay us, and that surely on the face of it, for services that he shall desire to have performed. Here also, if properly considered, there is a question of transcendental honesty. To give the public what they do not want, and yet expect to be supported, we have there a strange pretension, and yet not uncommon, above all with painters. The first duty in this world is for a man to pay his way. When that is quite accomplished, he may plunge into what eccentricity he likes, but emphatically not till then. Till then, he must pay assiduous court to the bourgeois who carries the purse. And if in the course of these capitulations he shall falsify his talent, it can never have been a strong one, and he will have preserved a better thing than talent character. or if he be of a mind so independent that he cannot stoop to this necessity, one course is yet open. He can desist from art and follow some more manly way of life. I speak of a more manly way of life. It is a point on which I must be frank. To live by a pleasure is not a high calling. It involves patronage, however veiled. It numbers the artist, however ambitious, along with dancing girls and billiard markers. The French have a romantic evasion for one employment, and call its practitioners the daughters of joy. The artist is of the same family. He is of the sons of joy, chose his trade to please himself, gains his livelihood by pleasing others, and has parted with something of the sterner dignity of man. Journals but a little while ago declaimed against the Tennyson peerage, and this son of joy was blamed for condescension when he followed the example of Lord Lawrence and Lord Cairns and Lord Clyde. The poet was more happily inspired. With a better modesty he accepted the honour, and anonymous journalists have not yet, if I am to believe them, recovered the vicarious disgrace to their profession. When it comes to their turn, these gentlemen can do themselves more justice, and I shall be glad to think of it, for to my barbarian eyesight even Lord Tennyson looks somewhat out of place in that assembly. There should be no honours for the artist. He has already in the practice of his art more than his share of the rewards of life. The honours are preempted for other trades, less agreeable and perhaps more useful. But the devil in these trades of pleasing is to fail to please. In ordinary occupations, a man offers to do a certain thing or to produce a certain article with a merely conventional accomplishment, a design in which we may almost say it is difficult to fail. But the artist steps forth out of the crowd and proposes to delight an impudent design in which it is impossible to fail without odious circumstances. The poor daughter of joy, carrying her smiles and finery, quite unregarded through the crowd, makes a figure which it is impossible to recall without a wounding pity. She is the type of the unsuccessful artist. The actor, the dancer, and the singer must appear like her in person and drain publicly the cup of failure. But though the rest of us escape this crowning bitterness of the pillory, we all court in essence the same humiliation. We all profess to be able to delight, and how few of us are. We all pledge ourselves to be able to continue to delight, and the day will come to each, and even to the most admired, when the ardor shall have declined and the cunning shall be lost, and he shall sit by his deserted booth ashamed. Then shall he see himself condemned to do work for which he blushes to take payment. Then, as if his lot were not already cruel, he must lie exposed to the gibes of the wreckers of the press, who earn a little bitter bread by the condemnation of trash which they have not read, and the praise of excellence which they cannot understand. And observe that this seems almost the necessary end at least of writers. Les Blancs et les Bleus, for instance, is of an order of merit very different from Le Vicomte de Bragelonne, and if any gentleman can bear to spy upon the nakedness of Castle Dangerous, his name I think is Ham. Let it be enough for the rest of us to read of it, not without tears, in the pages of Lockhart. Thus in old age, when occupation and comfort are most needful, the writer must lay aside at once his pastime and his breadwinner. The painter indeed, if he succeed at all in engaging the attention of the public, gains great sums and can stand to his easel until a great age without dishonourable failure. The writer has the double misfortune to be ill paid while he can work, and to be incapable of working when he is old. It is thus a way of life which conducts directly to a false position. For the writer, in spite of notorious examples to the contrary, must look to be ill-paid. Tennyson and Montepin make handsome livelihoods, but we cannot all hope to be Tennyson, and we do not all perhaps desire to be Montepin. If you adopt an art to be your trade, weed your mind at the outset of all desire of money. What you may decently expect, if you have some talent and much industry, is such an income as a clerk will earn with 1/10 or perhaps 1/20 of your nervous output. Nor have you the right to look for more. In the wages of the life, not in the wages of the trade, lies your reward. The work is here, the wages. It will be seen I have little sympathy with the common lamentations of the artist class. Perhaps they do not remember the hire of the field labourer, or do they think no parallel will lie? Perhaps they have never observed what is the retiring allowance of a field officer, or do they suppose their contributions to the arts of pleasing more important than the services of a colonel? Perhaps they forget on how little Millet was content to live, or do they think, because they have less genius, they stand excused from the display of equal virtues? But upon one point there should be no dubiety. If a man be not frugal, he has no business in the arts. If he be not frugal, he steers directly for that last tragic scene of Le Vieux Saltimbanque. If he be not frugal, he will find it hard to continue to be honest. Some day, when the butcher is knocking at the door, he may be tempted, he may be obliged, to turn out and sell a slovenly piece of work. If the obligation shall have arisen through no wantonness of his own, he is even to be commended. For words cannot describe how far more necessary it is that a man should support his family than that he should attain to or preserve distinction in the arts. But if the pressure comes through his own fault, he has stolen, and stolen under trust, and stolen which is the worst of all in such a way that no law can reach him. And now you may perhaps ask me, if the debutant artist is to have no thought of money, and if, as is implied, he is to expect no honors from the state, may he not at least look forward to the delights of popularity? Praise, you will tell me, is a savory dish, and in so far as you may mean the countenance of other artists, you would put your finger on one of the most essential and enduring pleasures of the career of art. But in so far as you should have an eye to the commendations of the public or the notice of the newspapers, be sure you would but be cherishing a dream. It is true that in certain esoteric journals the author, for instance, is duly criticized, and that he is often praised a great deal more than he deserves, sometimes for qualities which he prided himself on eschewing, and sometimes by ladies and gentlemen who have denied themselves the privilege of reading his work. But if a man be sensitive to this wild praise, we must suppose him equally alive to that which often accompanies, and always follows it, wild ridicule. A man may have done well for years, and then he may fail. He will hear of his failure, or he may have done well for years, and still do well, but the critics may have tired of praising him, or there may have sprung up some new idol of the instant, some dust a little gilt, to whom they now prefer to offer sacrifice. Here is the obverse, and the reverse of that empty and ugly thing called popularity. Will any man suppose it worth the gaining, on falling in love? Lord, what fools these mortals be! There is only one event in life which really astonishes a man and startles him out of his prepared opinions. Everything else befalls him very much as he expected. Event succeeds to event with an agreeable variety indeed, but with little that is either startling or intense. They form together no more than a sort of background or running accompaniment to the man's own reflections, and he falls naturally into a cool, curious, and smiling habit of mind, and builds himself up in a conception of life which expects tomorrow to be after the pattern of today and yesterday. He may be accustomed to the vagaries of his friends and acquaintances under the influence of love. He may sometimes look forward to it for himself with an incomprehensible expectation, but it is a subject in which neither intuition nor the behavior of others will help the philosopher to the truth. There is probably nothing rightly thought or rightly written on this matter of love that is not a piece of the person's experience. I remember an anecdote of a well-known French theorist who was debating a point eagerly in his cenacle. It was objected against him that he had never experienced love, whereupon he arose, left the society, and made it a point not to return to it until he considered that he had supplied the defect now. He remarked on entering, "Now I am in a position to continue the discussion." Perhaps he had not penetrated very deeply into the subject after all. But the story indicates right thinking and may serve as an apologue to readers of this essay. When at last the scales fall from his eyes, it is not without something of the nature of dismay that the man finds himself in such changed conditions. He has to deal with commanding emotions instead of the easy dislikes and preferences in which he has hitherto passed his days, and he recognizes capabilities for pain and pleasure of which he had not yet suspected the existence. Falling in love is the one illogical adventure, the one thing of which we are tempted to think as supernatural. In our trite and reasonable world, the effect is out of all proportion with the cause. Two persons, neither of them, it may be, very amiable or very beautiful, meet, speak a little, and look a little into each other's eyes. That has been done a dozen or so of times in the experience of either with no great result, but on this occasion all is different. They fall at once into that state in which another person becomes, to us, the very gist and center point of God's creation, and demolishes our laborious theories with a smile in which our ideas are so bound up with the one master thought that even the trivial cares of our own person become so many acts of devotion, and the love of life itself is translated into a wish to remain in the same world with so precious and desirable a fellow creature and all the while their acquaintances look on in stupor, and ask each other with almost passionate emphasis, what so-and-so can see in that woman, or such an one in that man? I'm sure, gentlemen, I cannot tell you. For my part, I cannot think what the women mean. It might be very well if the Apollo Belvedere should suddenly glow all over into life, and step forward from the pedestal with that godlike air of his, but of the misbegotten changelings who call themselves men, and prate intolerably over dinner tables, I never saw one who seemed worthy to inspire love, no, nor read of any, except Leonardo da Vinci, and perhaps Goethe in his youth, about women. I entertain a somewhat different opinion, but there I have the misfortune to be a man. There are many matters in which you may waylay destiny, and bid him stand and deliver. Hard work, high thinking, adventurous excitement, and a great deal more that forms a part of this or the other person's spiritual bill of fare are within the reach of almost anyone who can dare a little and be patient. But it is by no means in the way of everyone to fall in love. You know the difficulty Shakespeare was put into when Queen Elizabeth asked him to show Falstaff in love. I do not believe that Henry Fielding was ever in love. Scott, if it were not for a passage or two in Rob Roy, would give me very much the same effect. These are great names, and what is more to the purpose, strong, healthy, high-strung, and generous natures, of whom the reverse might have been expected. As for the innumerable army of anemic and tailorish persons who occupy the face of this planet with so much propriety, it is palpably absurd to imagine them in any such situation as a love affair. A wet rag goes safely by the fire, and if a man is blind, he cannot expect to be much impressed by romantic scenery. Apart from all this, many lovable people miss each other in the world, or meet under some unfavorable star. There's the nice and critical moment of declaration to be got over. From timidity or lack of opportunity, a good half of possible love cases never get so far, and at least another quarter do there cease and determine. A very adroit person, to be sure, manages to prepare the way and out with his declaration in the nick of time, and then there is a fine solid sort of man who goes on from snub to snub, and if he has to declare 40 times, will continue imperturbably declaring amid the astonished consideration of men and angels, until he has a favorable answer. I dare say if one were a woman, one would like to marry a man who was capable of doing this, but not quite one who had done so. It is just a little bit abject, and somehow just a little bit gross, and marriages in which one of the parties has been thus battered into consent scarcely form agreeable subjects for meditation. Love should run to meet love with open arms. Indeed, the ideal story is that of two people who go into love step for step with a fluttered consciousness, like a pair of children venturing together into a dark room from the first moment when they see each other. With a pang of curiosity, through stage after stage of growing pleasure and embarrassment, they can read the expression of their own trouble in each other's eyes. There is here no declaration properly so called. The feeling is so plainly shared that as soon as the man knows what it is in his own heart, he is sure of what it is in the woman's. This simple accident of falling in love is as beneficial as it is astonishing. It arrests the petrifying influence of years, disproves cold-blooded and cynical conclusions, and awakens dormant sensibilities. Hitherto the man had found it a good policy to disbelieve the existence of any enjoyment which was out of his reach, and thus he turned his back upon the strong, sunny parts of nature, and accustomed himself to look exclusively on what was common and dull. He accepted a prose ideal, let himself go blind of many sympathies by disuse, and if he were young and witty or beautiful, wilfully forewent these advantages. He joined himself to the following of what, in the old mythology of love, was prettily called nonchaloir, and in an odd mixture of feelings, a fling of self-respect, a preference for selfish liberty, and a great dash of that fear with which honest people regard serious interests, kept himself back from the straightforward course of life among certain selected activities. And now all of a sudden he is unhorsed like St. Paul from his infidel affectation. His heart, which has been ticking accurate seconds for the last year, gives a bound and begins to beat high and irregularly in his breast. It seems as if he had never heard or felt or seen until that moment, and by the report of his memory he must have lived his past life between sleep and waking, or with the preoccupied attention of a brown study. He is practically incommoded by the generosity of his feelings, smiles much when he is alone, and develops a habit of looking rather blankly upon the moon and stars, but it is not at all within the province of a prose essayist to give a picture of this hyperbolical frame of mind. And the thing has been done already, and that to admiration in Adelaide, in Tennyson's Maud, and in some of Heine's songs you get the absolute expression of this midsummer spirit. Romeo and Juliet were very much in love, although they tell me some German critics are of a different opinion, probably the same who would have us think Mercutio a dull fellow. Poor Antony was in love, and no mistake. That lay figure Marius in Les Miserables is also a genuine case in his own way, and worth observation. A good many of George Sand's people are thoroughly in love, and so are a good many of George Meredith's altogether. There is plenty to read on the subject, if the root of the matter be in him, and if he has the requisite chords to set in vibration. A young man may occasionally enter with the key of art into that land of Beulah, which is upon the borders of heaven, and within sight of the city of love. There let him sit a while, to hatch delightful hopes and perilous illusions. One thing that accompanies the passion in its first blush is certainly difficult to explain. It comes, I do not quite see how, that from having a very supreme sense of pleasure in all parts of life, in lying down to sleep, in waking, in motion, in breathing, in continuing to be, the lover begins to regard his happiness as beneficial for the rest of the world and highly meritorious in himself. Our race has never been able contentedly to suppose that the noise of its wars conducted by a few young gentlemen in a corner of an inconsiderable star does not re-echo among the courts of heaven with quite a formidable effect. In much the same taste, when people find a great to-do in their own breasts, they imagine it must have some influence in their neighborhood. The presence of the two lovers is so enchanting to each other that it seems as if it must be the best thing possible for everybody else. They are half inclined to fancy it is because of them and their love that the sky is blue and the sun shines, and certainly the weather is usually fine while people are courting in point. Of fact, although the happy man feels very kindly towards others of his own sex, there is apt to be something too much of the magnifico in his demeanor. If people grow presuming and self-important over such matters as a dukedom or the Holy See, they will scarcely support the diseasiest elevation in life without some suspicion of a strut. And the diseased elevation is to love and be loved in return. Consequently, accepted lovers are a trifle condescending in their address to other men. An overweening sense of the passion and importance of life hardly conduces to simplicity of manner. To women, they feel very nobly, very purely, and very generously, as if they were so many Joan of Arcs, but this does not come out in their behavior, and they treat them to Grandisonian airs marked with a suspicion of fatuity. I'm not quite certain that women do not like this sort of thing, but really, after having bemused myself over Daniel Deronda, I have given up trying to understand what they like. If it did nothing else, this sublime and ridiculous superstition that the pleasure of the pair is somehow blessed to others, and everybody is made happier in their happiness, would serve at least to keep love generous and great-hearted. Nor is it quite a baseless superstition after all. Other lovers are hugely interested. They strike the nicest balance between pity and approval when they see people aping the greatness of their own sentiments. It is an understood thing in the play that while the young gentlefolk are courting on the terrace, a rough flirtation is being carried on and a light, trivial sort of love is growing up between the footman and the singing chambermaid. As people are generally cast for the leading parts in their own imaginations, the reader can apply the parallel to real life without much chance of going wrong. In short, they are quite sure this other love affair is not so deep-seated as their own, but they like dearly to see it going forward, and love, considered as a spectacle, must have attractions for many who are not of the confraternity. The sentimental old maid is a commonplace of the novelists, and he must be rather a poor sort of human being, to be sure, who can look on at this pretty madness without indulgence and sympathy. For nature commends itself to people with a most insinuating art. The busiest is now and again arrested by a great sunset, and you may be as pacific or as cold-blooded as you will, but you cannot help some emotion when you read of well-disputed battles, or meet a pair of lovers in the lanes. Certainly, whatever it may be with regard to the world at large, This idea of beneficent pleasure is true as between the sweethearts. To do good and communicate is the lover's grand intention. It is the happiness of the other that makes his own most intense gratification. It is not possible to disentangle the different emotions, the pride, humility, pity, and passion, which are excited by a look of happy love or an unexpected caress. To make oneself beautiful, to dress the hair, to excel in talk, to do anything and all things that puff out the character and attributes and make them imposing in the eyes of others, is not only to magnify oneself, but to offer the most delicate homage at the same time. And it is in this latter intention that they are done by lovers, for the essence of love is kindness, and indeed it may be best defined as passionate kindness, so to speak, run mad and become importunate and violent. Vanity in a merely personal sense exists no longer. The lover takes a perilous pleasure in privately displaying his weak points and having them one after another accepted and condoned. He wishes to be assured that he is not loved for this or that good quality, but for himself, or something as like himself as he can contrive to set forward. For although it may have been a very difficult thing to paint the marriage of Cana or write the fourth act of Antony and Cleopatra, there is a more difficult piece of art before everyone in this world who cares to set about explaining his own character to others. Words and acts are easily wrenched from their true significance, and they are all the language we have to come and go upon. A pitiful job we make of it. As a rule, for better or worse, people mistake our meaning and take our emotions at a wrong valuation, and generally we rest pretty content with our failures. We are content to be misapprehended by cackling flirts. But when once a man is moonstruck with this affection of love, he makes it a point of honor to clear such dubieties away. He cannot have the best of her sex misled upon a point of this importance, and his pride revolts at being loved in a mistake. He discovers a great reluctance to return on former periods of his life, to all that has not been shared with her, rights and duties, bygone fortunes and dispositions. He can look back only by a difficult and repugnant effort of the will that he should have wasted some years in ignorance of what alone was really important, that he may have entertained the thought of other women with any show of complacency, is a burden almost too heavy for his self-respect, but it is the thought of another past that rankles in his spirit like a poisoned wound, that he himself made a fashion of being alive in the bald, beggarly days before a certain meeting, is deplorable enough in all good conscience, but that she should have permitted herself the same liberty seems inconsistent with a divine providence. A great many people run down jealousy on the score that it is an artificial feeling as well as practically inconvenient. This is scarcely fair, for the feeling on which it merely attends, like an ill-humoured courtier, is itself artificial in exactly the same sense and to the same degree. I suppose what is meant by that objection is that jealousy has not always been a character of man, formed no part of that very modest kit of sentiments with which he is supposed to have begun the world, but waited to make its appearance in better days and among richer natures. And this is equally true of love and friendship and love of country and delight in what they call the beauties of nature and most other things worth having. Love in particular will not endure any historical scrutiny. To all who have fallen across it, it is one of the most incontestable facts in the world. But if you begin to ask what it was in other periods and countries, in Greece for instance, the strangest doubts begin to spring up, and everything seems so vague and changing that a dream is logical in comparison. Jealousy, at any rate, is one of the consequences of love. You may like it or not at pleasure, but there it is. It is not exactly jealousy, however, that we feel when we reflect on the past of those we love. A bundle of letters found after years of happy union creates no sense of insecurity in the present, and yet it will pain a man sharply. The two people entertain no vulgar doubt of each other, but this pre-existence of both occurs to the mind as something indelicate, to be altogether right. They should have had twin birth together at the same moment with the feeling that unites them. Then indeed it would be simple and perfect and without reserve or afterthought. Then they would understand each other with a fullness impossible otherwise. There would be no barrier between them of associations that cannot be imparted. They would be led into none of those comparisons that send the blood back to the heart, and they would know that there had been no time lost, and they had been together as much as was possible. For besides terror for the separation that must follow some time or other, in the future men feel anger, and something like remorse, when they think of that other separation which endured until they met. Someone has written that love makes people believe in immortality, because there seems not to be room enough in life for so great a tenderness, and it is inconceivable that the most masterful of our emotions should have no more than the spare moments of a few years. Indeed, it seems strange, but if we call to mind analogies, we can hardly regard it as impossible. The blind bow-boy who smiles upon us from the end of terraces in old Dutch gardens laughingly hails his bird bolts among a fleeting generation. But for as fast as ever he shoots, the game dissolves and disappears into eternity from under his falling arrows. This one is gone ere he is struck. The other has but time to make one gesture and give one passionate cry, and they are all the things of a moment. When the generation is gone, when the play is over, when the 30 years panorama has been withdrawn in tatters from the stage of the world, we may ask what has become of these great, weighty, and undying loves, and the sweethearts who despised mortal conditions in a fine credulity, and they can only show us a few songs in a bygone taste, a few actions worth remembering, and a few children who have retained some happy stamp from the disposition of their parents, crabbed age and youth. You know, my mother now and then argues very notably, always very warmly at least. I happen often to differ from her, and we both think so well of our own arguments that we very seldom are so happy as to convince one another. A pretty common case, I believe. In all vehement debatings, she says I'm too witty, Englishe, too pert, I that she is too wise, that is to say, being likewise put into English, not so young as she has been. Miss Howe to Miss Harlowe, Clarissa Voldeu, letter C. There is a strong feeling in favor of cowardly and prudential proverbs. The sentiments of a man, while he is full of ardor and hope, are to be received, it is supposed, with some qualification. But when the same person has ignominiously failed, and begins to eat up his words, he should be listened to like an oracle. Most of our pocket wisdom is conceived for the use of mediocre people, to discourage them from ambitious attempts, and generally console them in their mediocrity. And since mediocre people constitute the bulk of humanity, this is no doubt very properly so. But it does not follow that the one sort of proposition is any less true than the other, or that Icarus is not to be more praised, and perhaps more envied than Mr. Samuel Budget. The successful merchant, the one is dead, to be sure, while the other is still in his counting house counting out his money. And doubtless this is a consideration. But we have, on the other hand, some bold and magnanimous sayings common to high races and natures, which set forth the advantage of the losing side, and proclaim it better to be a dead lion than a living dog. It is difficult to fancy how the mediocrities reconcile such sayings with their proverbs. According to the latter, every lad who goes to sea is an egregious ass. Never to forget your umbrella through a long life would seem a higher and wiser flight of achievement than to go smiling to the stake. And so long as you are a bit of a coward and inflexible in money matters, you fulfill the whole duty of man. It is a still more difficult consideration for our average men that while all their teachers, from Solomon down to Benjamin Franklin and the ungodly Binney, have inculcated the same ideal of manners, caution, and respectability, those characters in history who have most notoriously flown in the face of such precepts are spoken of in hyperbolical terms of praise, and honored with public monuments in the streets of our commercial centers. This is very bewildering to the moral sense. You have Joan of Arc, who left a humble but honest and reputable livelihood under the eyes of her parents to go a-colonialing in the company of rowdy soldiers against the enemies of France, surely a melancholy example for one's daughters. And then you have Columbus, who may have pioneered America, but when all is said, was a most imprudent navigator. His life is not the kind of thing one would like to put into the hands of young people. Rather, one would do one's utmost to keep it from their knowledge, as a red flag of adventure and disintegrating influence in life. The time would fail me if I were to recite all the big names in history whose exploits are perfectly irrational and even shocking to the business mind. The incongruity is speaking, and I imagine it must engender among the mediocrities a very peculiar attitude towards the nobler and showier sides of national life. They will read of the charge of Balaclava in much the same spirit as they assist at a performance of the Lion's Mail. Persons of substance take in the Times and sit composedly in pits or boxes according to the degree of their prosperity in business. As for the generals who go galloping up and down among bombshells in absurd cocked hats, as for the actors who raddle their faces and demean themselves for hire upon the stage, they must belong, thank God, to a different order of beings whom we watch as we watch the clouds careering in the windy bottomless inane, or read about like characters in ancient and rather fabulous annals. Our offspring would no more think of copying their behavior, let us hope, than of doffing their clothes and painting themselves blue in consequence of certain admissions in the first chapter of their school history of England, discredited as they are in practice. The cowardly proverbs hold their own in theory, and it is another instance of the same spirit that the opinions of old men about life have been accepted as final. All sorts of allowances are made for the illusions of youth, and none or almost none for the disenchantments of age. It is held to be a good taunt, and somehow or other to clinch the question logically. When an old gentleman waggles his head and says, "Ah, so I thought when I was your age," it is not thought an answer at all. If the young man retorts, "My venerable sir, so I shall most probably think when I am yours," and yet the one is as good as the other. Pass for pass, tit for tat, a Roland for an Oliver. Opinion in good men, says Milton, is but knowledge in the making. All opinions properly so called are stages on the road to truth. It does not follow that a man will travel any farther, but if he has really considered the world and drawn a conclusion, he has travelled as far. This does not apply to formulae got by rote, which are stages on the road to nowhere, but second childhood and the grave. To have a catchword in your mouth is not the same thing as to hold an opinion. Still less is it the same thing as to have made one for yourself. There are too many of these catchwords in the world for people to rap out upon you like an oath and by way of an argument. They have a currency as intellectual counters, and many respectable persons pay their way with nothing else. They seem to stand for vague bodies of theory in the background. The imputed virtue of folios full of knockdown arguments is supposed to reside in them, just as some of the majesty of the British Empire dwells in the constable's truncheon. They are used in pure superstition, as old clodhoppers spoil Latin by way of an exorcism, and yet they are vastly serviceable for checking unprofitable discussion and stopping the mouths of babes and sucklings. And when a young man comes to a certain stage of intellectual growth, the examination of these counters forms a gymnastic at once amusing and fortifying to the mind. Because I have reached Paris, I am not ashamed of having passed through New Haven and Dieppe. They were very good places to pass through, and I am none the less at my destination. All my old opinions were only stages on the way to the one I now hold, as itself is only a stage on the way to something else. I am no more abashed at having been a red-hot socialist with a panacea of my own than at having been a sucking infant. Doubtless the world is quite right in a million ways, but you have to be kicked about a little to convince you of the fact, and in the meanwhile you must do something, be something, believe something. It is not possible to keep the mind in a state of accurate balance and blank, and even if you could do so, instead of coming ultimately to the right conclusion, you would be very apt to remain in a state of balance and blank to perpetuity, even in quite intermediate stages. A dash of enthusiasm is not a thing to be ashamed of in the retrospect. If St. Paul had not been a very zealous Pharisee, he would have been a colder Christian. For my part, I look back to the time when I was a socialist with something like regret. I have convinced myself for the moment that we had better leave these great changes to what we call great blind forces, their blindness being so much more perspicacious than the little peering, partial eyesight of men. I seem to see that my own scheme would not answer, and all the other schemes I ever heard propounded would depress some elements of goodness just as much as they encouraged others. Now I know that in thus turning conservative with years, I'm going through the normal cycle of change and traveling in the common orbit of men's opinions. I submit to this as I would submit to gout or grey hair as a concomitant of growing age or else of failing animal heat. But I do not acknowledge that it is necessarily a change for the better. Dare say it is deplorably for the worse. I have no choice in the business, and can no more resist this tendency of my mind than I could prevent my body from beginning to totter and decay. If I am spared, as the phrase runs, I shall doubtless outlive some troublesome desires, but I am in no hurry about that, nor, when the time comes, shall I plume myself on the immunity. Just in the same way, I do not greatly pride myself on having outlived my belief in the fairy tales of socialism. Old people have faults of their own. They tend to become cowardly, niggardly, and suspicious. Whether from the growth of experience or the decline of animal heat, I see that age leads to these and certain other faults, and it follows, of course, that while in one sense I hope I am journeying towards the truth, in another I am indubitably posting towards these forms and sources of error. As we go catching at this or that corner of knowledge, now getting a foresight of generous possibilities, now chilled with a glimpse of prudence, we may compare the headlong course of our years to a swift torrent in which a man is carried away. Now he is dashed against a boulder, now he grapples for a moment to a trailing spray. At the end he is hurled out and overwhelmed in a dark and bottomless ocean. We have no more than glimpses and touches. We are torn away from our theories. We are spun round and shown this or the other view of life, until only fools or knaves can hold to their opinions. We take a sight at a condition in life and say we have studied it. Our most elaborate view is no more than an impression. If we had breathing space, we should take the occasion to modify and adjust. But at this breakneck hurry, we are no sooner boys than we are adult, no sooner in love than married, or jilted, no sooner one age than we begin to be another, and no sooner in the fullness of our manhood than we begin to decline towards the grave. It is in vain to seek for consistency or expect clear and stable views in a medium so perturbed and fleeting. This is no cabinet science in which things are tested to a scruple. We theorize with a pistol to our head. We are confronted with a new set of conditions on which we have not only to pass a judgment, but to take action before the hour is at an end. And we cannot even regard ourselves as a constant. In this flux of things, our identity itself seems in a perpetual variation, and not infrequently we find our own disguise the strangest in the masquerade. In the course of time, we grow to love things we hated and hate things we loved. Milton is not so dull as he once was, nor perhaps Ainsworth so amusing. It is decidedly harder to climb trees, and not nearly so hard to sit still. There is no use pretending. Even the thrice royal game of hide and seek has somehow lost in zest. All our attributes are modified or changed, and it will be a poor account of us if our views do not modify and change in a proportion. To hold the same views at 40 as we held at 20 is to have been stupefied for a score of years and take rank, not as a prophet but as an unteachable brat, well birched and none the wiser. It is as if a ship captain should sail to India from the port of London, and having brought a chart of the Thames on deck at his first setting out, should obstinately use no other for the whole voyage. And mark you, it would be no less foolish to begin at Gravesend with a chart of the Red Sea. Si jeunesse savait, si vieillesse pouvait, is a very pretty sentiment, but not necessarily right. In 5 cases out of 10, it is not so much that the young people do not know as that they do not choose. There is something irreverent in the speculation, but perhaps the want of power has more to do with the wise resolutions of age than we are always willing to admit. It would be an instructive experiment to make an old man young again and leave him all his savoir. I scarcely think he would put his money in the savings bank after all. I doubt if he would be such an admirable son as we are led to expect, and as for his conduct in love, I believe firmly he would out-Herod Herod and put the whole of his new compares to the blush. Prudence is a wooden juggernaut before whom Benjamin Franklin walks with the portly air of a high priest, and after whom dances many a successful merchant in the character of Aëtes. But it is not a deity to cultivate in youth. If a man lives to any considerable age, it cannot be denied that he laments his imprudences, but I notice he often laments his youth a deal more bitterly, and with a more genuine intonation. It is customary to say that age should be considered, because it comes last. It seems just as much to the point that youth comes first, and the scale fairly kicks the beam. If you go on to add that age, in a majority of cases, never comes at all. Disease and accident make short work of even the most prosperous persons. Death costs nothing, and the expense of a headstone is an inconsiderable trifle to the happy heir. To be suddenly snuffed out in the middle of ambitious schemes is tragical enough at best, but when a man has been grudging himself his own life in the meanwhile, and saving up everything for the festival that was never to be, it becomes that hysterically moving sort of tragedy which lies on the confines of farce. The victim is dead, and he has cunningly overreached himself. A combination of calamities none the less absurd for being grim. To husband a favourite claret until the batch turns sour is not at all an artful stroke of policy, and how much more, with a whole cellar, a whole bodily existence, people may lay down their lives with cheerfulness in the sure expectation of a blessed immortality. But that is a different affair from giving up youth with all its admirable pleasures in the hope of a better quality of gruel in a more than problematical, nay, more than improbable old age. We should not compliment a hungry man who should refuse a whole dinner and reserve all his appetite for the dessert before he knew whether there was to be any dessert or not. If there be such a thing as imprudence in the world, we surely have it here. We sail in leaky bottoms and on great and perilous waters. And to take a cue from the dolorous old naval ballad, we have heard the mermaidens singing and know that we shall never see dry land any more. Old and young, we are all on our last cruise. If there is a fill of tobacco among the crew, for God's sake pass it round, and let us have a pipe before we go. Indeed, by the report of our elders, this nervous preparation for old age is only trouble thrown away. We fall on guard, and after all it is a friend who comes to meet us. After the sun is down and the west faded, the heavens begin to fill with shining stars. So, as we grow old, a sort of equable jog-trot of feeling is substituted for the violent ups and downs of passion and disgust. The same influence that restrains our hopes quiets our apprehensions. If the pleasures are less intense, the troubles are milder and more tolerable, and in a word, this period, for which we are asked to hoard up everything as for a time of famine, is, in its own right, the richest, easiest, and happiest of life. Nay, by managing its own work and following its own happy inspiration, youth is doing the best it can to endow the leisure of age. A full busy youth is your only prelude to a self-contained and independent age, and the muff inevitably develops into the bore. There are not many Dr. Johnsons to set forth upon their first romantic voyage at 64. If we wish to scale Mont Blanc or visit a thieves' kitchen in the East End, to go down in a diving dress or up in a balloon, we must be about it while we are still young. It will not do to delay until we are clogged with prudence and limping with rheumatism, and people begin to ask us, what does gravity out of bed? Youth is the time to go flashing from one end of the world to the other, both in mind and body, to try the manners of different nations, to hear the chimes at midnight, to see sunrise in town and country, to be converted at a revival, to circumnavigate the metaphysics, write halting verses, run a mile to see a fire, and wait all day long in the theatre to applaud Hernani. There is some meaning in the old theory about wild oats, and a man who has not had his green sickness and got done with it for good is as little to be depended on as an unvaccinated infant. It is extraordinary, says Lord Beaconsfield, one of the brightest and best preserved of youths up to the date of his last novel. It is extraordinary how hourly and how violently change the feelings of an inexperienced young man. And this mobility is a special talent entrusted to his care, a sort of indestructible virginity, a magic armor with which he can pass unhurt through great dangers and come unbedaubed out of the myriest passages. Let him voyage, speculate, see all that he can, do all that he may. His soul has as many lives as a cat. He will live in all weathers and never be a halfpenny the worse. Those who go to the devil in youth with anything like a fair chance were probably little worth saving from the first. They must have been feeble fellows, creatures made of putty and packthread, without steel or fire, anger or true joyfulness in their composition. We may sympathize with their parents, but there is not much cause to go into mourning for themselves, for to be quite honest, the weak brother is the worst of mankind. When the old man waggles his head and says, "Ah, so I thought when I was your age," he has proved the youth's case, doubtless. Whether from growth of experience or decline of animal heat, he thinks so no longer. But he thought so while he was young. And all men have thought so while they were young, since there was dew in the morning or hawthorn in May, And here is another young man adding his vote to those of previous generations and riveting another link to the chain of testimony. It is as natural and as right for a young man to be imprudent and exaggerated, to live in swoops and circles and beat about his cage like any other wild thing newly captured, as it is for old men to turn grey, or mothers to love their offspring, or heroes to die for something worthier than their lives, by way of an apology for the aged, when they feel more than usually tempted to offer their advice. Let me recommend the following little tale. A child who had been remarkably fond of toys, and in particular of lead soldiers, found himself growing to the level of acknowledged boyhood without any abatement of this childish taste. He was 13. Already he had been taunted for dallying overlong about the playbox. He had to blush if he was found among his lead soldiers. The shades of the prison house were closing about him with a vengeance. There is nothing more difficult than to put the thoughts of children into the language of their elders, but this is the effect of his meditations at this juncture. Plainly, he said, I must give up my playthings in the meanwhile, since I am not in a position to secure myself against idle jeers. At the same time, I am sure that playthings are the very pick of life. All people give them up out of the same pusillanimous respect for those who are a little older. And if they do not return to them as soon as they can, it is only because they grow stupid and forget. I shall be wiser. I shall conform for a little to the ways of their foolish world. But so soon as I have made enough money, I shall retire and shut myself up among my playthings until the day I die. Nay, as he was passing in the train along the Estoril mountains between Cannes and Fratius, he remarked a pretty house in an orange garden at the angle of a bay, and decided that this should be his happy valley. Astrea Redux. Childhood was to come again. The idea has an air of simple nobility to me, not unworthy of Cincinnatus. And yet, as the reader has probably anticipated, it is never likely to be carried into effect. There was a worm, I've the bud, a fatal error in the premises. Childhood must pass away, and then youth, as surely as age approaches. The true wisdom is to be always seasonable, and to change with a good grace in changing circumstances, to love playthings well as a child, to lead an adventurous and honorable youth, and to settle when the time arrives into a green and smiling age, is to be a good artist in life and deserve well of yourself and your neighbor. You need repent none of your youthful vagaries. They may have been over the score on one side, just as those of age are probably over the score on the other. But they had a point. They not only befitted your age and expressed its attitude and passions, but they had a relation to what was outside of you and implied criticisms on the existing state of things which you need not allow to have been undeserved, because you now see that they were partial. All error, not merely verbal, is a strong way of stating that the current truth is incomplete. The follies of youth have a basis in sound reason, just as much as the embarrassing questions put by babes and sucklings. Their most antisocial acts indicate the defects of our society. When the torrent sweeps the man against a boulder, you must expect him to scream, and you need not be surprised if the scream is sometimes a theory. Shelley, chafing at the Church of England, discovered the cure of all evils in universal atheism. Generous lads, irritated at the injustices of society, see nothing for it but the abolishment of everything and kingdom come of anarchy. Shelley was a young fool, so are these cock-sparrow revolutionaries. But it is better to be a fool than to be dead. It is better to emit a scream in the shape of a theory than to be entirely insensible to the jars and incongruities of life and take everything as it comes in a forlorn stupidity. Some people swallow the universe like a pill. They travel on through the world, like smiling images pushed from behind. For God's sake, give me. The young man who has brains enough to make a fool of himself. As for the others, the irony of facts shall take it out of their hands and make fools of them in downright earnest, ere the farce be over. There shall be such a mopping and a mowing at the last day, and such blushing and confusion of countenance for all those who have been wise in their own esteem, and have not learnt the rough lessons that youth hands on to age. If we are indeed here to perfect and complete our own natures, and grow larger, stronger, and more sympathetic against some nobler career in the future, we had all best bestir ourselves to the utmost while we have the time. To equip a dull, respectable person with wings would be but to make a parody of an angel. In short, if youth is not quite right in its opinions, there is a strong probability that age is not much more so. Undying hope is co-ruler of the human bosom with infallible credulity. A man finds he has been wrong at every preceding stage of his career, only to deduce the astonishing conclusion that he is, at last, entirely right. Mankind, after centuries of failure, are still upon the eve of a thoroughly constitutional millennium. Since we have explored the maze so long without result, it follows, for poor human reason, that we cannot have to explore much longer. Close by must be the center, with a champagne luncheon and a piece of ornamental water. How if there were no center at all, but just one alley after another, and the whole world a labyrinth without end or issue? I overheard the other day a scrap of conversation, which I take the liberty to reproduce. What I advance is true, said one. But not the whole truth, answered the other. Sir, returned the first, and it seemed to me there was a smack of Dr. Johnson in the speech. Sir, there is no such thing as the whole truth. Indeed, there is nothing so evident in life as that there are two sides to a question. History is one long illustration. The forces of nature are engaged, day by day, in cudgelling it into our backward intelligences. We never pause for a moment's consideration, but we admit it as an axiom. An enthusiast sways humanity exactly by disregarding this great truth and dinning it into our ears that this or that question has only one possible solution. And your enthusiast is a fine florid fellow, dominates things for a while and shakes the world out of a doze. But when once he is gone, an army of quiet and uninfluential people set to work to remind us of the other side and demolish the generous imposture. While Calvin is putting everybody exactly right in his institutes and hot-headed Knox is thundering in the pulpit, Montaigne is already looking at the other side in his library in Perigord and predicting that they will find as much to quarrel about in the Bible as they had found already in the church. Age may have one side, but assuredly youth has the other. There is nothing more certain than that both are right, except perhaps that both are wrong. Let them agree to differ, for who knows but what agreeing to differ may not be a form of agreement rather than a form of difference? I suppose it is written that anyone who sets up for a bit of a philosopher must contradict himself to his very face. For here have I fairly talked myself into thinking that we have the whole thing before us at last, that there is no answer to the mystery, except that there are as many as you please, that there is no center to the maze because, like the famous sphere, its center is everywhere, and that agreeing to differ with every ceremony of politeness is the only one undisturbed song of pure consent, to which we are ever likely to lend our musical voices, on the enjoyment of unpleasant places. It is a difficult matter to make the most of any given place, and we have much in our own power. Things looked at patiently from one side after another generally end by showing a side that is beautiful. A few months ago some words were said in the portfolio as to an austere regimen in scenery, and such a discipline was then recommended as healthful and strengthening to the taste. That is the text, so to speak, of the present essay. This discipline in scenery, it must be understood, is something more than a mere walk before breakfast to whet the appetite. For when we are put down in some unsightly neighborhood, and especially if we have come to be more or less dependent on what we see, we must set ourselves to hunt out beautiful things with all the ardor and patience of a botanist after a ripe plant. Day by day, we perfect ourselves in the art of seeing nature more favorably. We learn to live with her, as people learn to live with fretful or violent spouses, to dwell lovingly on what is good, and shut our eyes against all that is bleak or inharmonious. We learn also to come to each place in the right spirit. The traveller, as Brantôme quaintly tells us, fait des discours en soi pour soutenir en chemin. And into these discourses he weaves something out of all that he sees and suffers by the way. They take their tone greatly from the varying character of the scene. A sharp ascent brings different thoughts from a level road, and the man's fancies grow lighter as he comes out of the wood into a clearing. Nor does the scenery any more affect the thoughts than the thoughts affect the scenery. We see places through our humours as through differently coloured glasses. We are ourselves a term in the equation, a note of the chord, and make discord or harmony almost at will. There is no fear for the result. If we can but surrender ourselves sufficiently to the country that surrounds and follows us, so that we are ever thinking suitable thoughts or telling ourselves some suitable sort of story as we go. We become thus, in some sense, a centre of beauty. We are provocative of beauty, much as a gentle and sincere character is provocative of sincerity and gentleness in others, and even where there is no harmony to be elicited by the quickest and most obedient of spirits. We may still embellish a place with some attraction of romance. We may learn to go far afield for associations, and handle them lightly when we have found them. Sometimes an old print comes to our aid. I have seen many a spot lit up at once with picturesque imaginations, by a reminiscence of Cowlett or Sadeller or Paul Brill. Dick Turpin has been my lay figure for many an English lane, and I suppose the Trossachs would hardly be the Trossachs for most tourists if a man of admirable romantic instinct had not peopled it for them with harmonious figures, and brought them thither with minds rightly prepared for the impression. There is half the battle in this preparation. For instance, I have rarely been able to visit in the proper spirit the wild and inhospitable places of our own highlands. I am happier where it is tame and fertile, and not readily pleased without trees. I understand that there are some phases of mental trouble that harmonize well with such surroundings, and that some persons, by the dispensing power of the imagination, can go back several centuries in spirit, and put themselves into sympathy with the hunted, houseless, unsociable way of life that was in its place upon these savage hills. Now, when I'm sad, I like nature to charm me out of my sadness, like David before Saul, and the thought of these past ages strikes nothing in me but an unpleasant pity, so that I can never hit on the right humour for this sort of landscape, and lose much pleasure in consequence. Still, even here, if I were only let alone, and time enough were given, I should have all manner of pleasures, and take many clear and beautiful images away with me when I left. When we cannot think ourselves into sympathy with the great features of a country, we learn to ignore them, and put our head among the grass for flowers, or pore, for long times together, over the changeful current of a stream. We come down to the sermon in stones, when we are shut out from any poem in the spread landscape. We begin to peep and botanize, we take an interest in birds and insects, we find many things beautiful in miniature. The reader will recollect the little summer scene in Wuthering Heights, the one warm scene, perhaps, in all that powerful, miserable novel, and the great feature that is made therein by grasses and flowers and a little sunshine. This is in the spirit of which I now speak. And lastly, we can go indoors. Interiors are sometimes as beautiful, often more picturesque, than the shows of the open air, and they have that quality of shelter of which I shall presently have more to say. With all this in mind, I have often been tempted to put forth the paradox that any place is good enough to live a life in, while it is only in a few, and those highly favoured that we can pass a few hours agreeably, for if we only stay long enough we become at home in the neighbourhood. Reminiscences spring up, like flowers, about uninteresting corners. We forget to some degree the superior loveliness of other places, and fall into a tolerant and sympathetic spirit, which is its own reward and justification. Looking back the other day on some recollections of my own, I was astonished to find how much I owed to such a residence. 6 weeks in one unpleasant countryside had done more, it seemed, to quicken and educate my sensibilities than many years in places that jumped more nearly with my inclination. The country to which I refer was a level and treeless plateau, over which the winds cut like a whip. For miles and miles it was the same. A river, indeed, fell into the sea near the town where I resided, but the valley of the river was shallow and bold, for as far up as ever I had the heart to follow it. There were roads, certainly, but roads that had no beauty or interest, for, as there was no timber, and but little irregularity of surface, you saw your whole walk exposed to you from the beginning. There was nothing left to fancy, nothing to expect, nothing to see by the wayside, save here and there an unhomely-looking homestead, and here and there a solitary, spectacled stonebreaker, and you were only accompanied, as you went doggedly forward, by the gaunt telegraph posts and the hum of the resonant wires in the keen sea wind. To one who had learned to know their song in warm, pleasant places by the Mediterranean, it seemed to taunt the country and make it still bleaker by suggested contrast. Even the waste places by the side of the road were not, as Hawthorne liked to put it, taken back to nature by any decent covering of vegetation. Wherever the land had the chance, it seemed to lie fallow. There is a certain tawny nudity of the south, bare sunburnt plains, coloured like a lion, and hills clothed only in the blue transparent air. But this was of another description. This was the nakedness of the north. The earth seemed to know that it was naked, and was ashamed and cold. It seemed to be always blowing on that coast. Indeed, this had passed into the speech of the inhabitants, and they saluted each other when they met with breezy, breezy, instead of the customary fine day of farther south. These continual winds were not like the harvest breeze, that just keeps an equable pressure against your face as you walk, and serves to set all the trees talking over your head, or bring round you the smell of the wet surface of the country after a shower. They were of the bitter, hard, persistent sort that interferes with sight and respiration, and makes the eyes sore. Even such winds as these have their own merit in proper time and place. It is pleasant to see them brandish great masses of shadow, and what a power they have over the color of the world. How they ruffle the solid woodlands in their passage, and make them shudder and whiten like a single willow. There is nothing more vertiginous than a wind like this among the woods, with all its sights and noises, and the effect gets between some painters and their sober eyesight, so that even when the rest of their picture is calm, the foliage is coloured like foliage in a gale. There was nothing, however, of this sort to be noticed in a country where there were no trees and hardly any shadows, save the passive shadows of clouds or those of rigid houses and walls. But the wind was nevertheless an occasion of pleasure, for nowhere could you taste more fully the pleasure of a sudden lull or a place of opportune shelter. The reader knows what I mean. He must remember how, when he has sat himself down behind a dike on a hillside, he delighted to hear the wind hiss vainly through the crannies at his back, how his body tingled all over with warmth, and it began to dawn upon him with a sort of slow surprise that the country was beautiful, the heather purple, and the faraway hills all marbled with sun and shadow. Wordsworth, in a beautiful passage of the Prelude, has used this as a figure for the feeling struck in us by the quiet by streets of London after the uproar of the great thoroughfares, and the comparison may be turned the other way with as good effect. Meanwhile the roar continues, till at length, escaped as from an enemy, we turn abruptly into some sequestered nook, still as a sheltered place when winds blow loud. I remember meeting a man once in a train who told me of what must have been quite the most perfect instance of this pleasure of escape. He had gone up one sunny, windy morning to the top of a great cathedral somewhere abroad. I think it was Cologne Cathedral, the great unfinished marvel by the Rhine, and after a long while in dark stairways he issued at last into the sunshine on a platform high above the town. At that elevation it was quite still and warm. The gale was only in the lower strata of the air, and he had forgotten it in the quiet interior of the church and during his long ascent. And so you may judge of his surprise when, resting his arms on the sunlit balustrade and looking over into the place far below him, he saw the good people holding on their hats and leaning hard against the wind as they walked. There is something to my fancy quite perfect in this little experience of my fellow travelers. The ways of men seem always very trivial to us when we find ourselves alone on a church top, with the blue sky and a few tall pinnacles, and see far below us the steep roofs and foreshortened buttresses, and the silent activity of the city streets. But how much more must they not have seemed so to him as he stood, not only above other men's business, but above other men's climate, in a golden zone like Apollo's. This was the sort of pleasure I found in the country of which I write. The pleasure was to be out of the wind and to keep it in memory all the time and hug oneself upon the shelter. And it was only by the sea that any such sheltered places were to be found. Between the black worm-eaten headlands there are little bights and havens, well screened from the wind and the commotion of the external sea, where the sand and weeds look up into the gazer's face from a depth of tranquil water, and the seabirds, screaming and flickering from the ruined crags, alone disturb the silence and the sunshine. One such place has impressed itself on my memory beyond all others. On a rock by the water's edge, old fighting men of the Norse breed had planted a double castle. The two stood wall to wall like semi-detached villas, and yet feud had run so high between their owners that one from out of a window shot the other as he stood in his own doorway. There is something in the juxtaposition of these two enemies full of tragic irony. It is grim to think of bearded men and bitter women taking hateful counsel together about the two-hole fires at night, when the sea boomed against the foundations and the wild winter wind was loose over the battlements. And in the study we may reconstruct for ourselves some pale figure of what life then was. Not so when we are there. When we are there, such thoughts come to us only to intensify a contrary impression, and association is turned against itself. I remember walking thither 3 afternoons in succession, my eyes weary with being set against the wind, and how, dropping suddenly over the edge of the down, I found myself in a new world of warmth and shelter, The wind from which I had escaped as from an enemy was seemingly quite local. It carried no clouds with it, and came from such a quarter that it did not trouble the sea within view. The two castles, black and ruinous as the rocks about them, were still distinguishable from these by something more insecure and fantastic in the outline, something that the last storm had left imminent and the next would demolish entirely. It would be difficult to render in words the sense of peace that took possession of me on these 3 afternoons. It was helped out, as I have said, by the contrast. The shore was battered and bemauled by previous tempests. I had the memory at heart of the insane strife of the pygmies who had erected these 2 castles and lived in them in mutual distrust and enmity, and knew I had only to put my head out of this little cup of shelter to find the hard wind blowing in my eyes. And yet there were the 2 great tracts of motionless blue air and peaceful sea looking on unconcerned and apart at the turmoil of the present moment and the memorials of the precarious past. There is ever something transitory and fretful in the impression of a high wind under a cloudless sky. It seems to have no root in the constitution of things. It must speedily begin to faint and wither away like a cut flower. And on those days the thought of the wind and the thought of human life came very near together in my mind. Our noisy years did indeed seem moments in the being of the eternal silence, and the wind in the face of that great field of stationary blue was as the wind of a butterfly's wing. The placidity of the sea was a thing likewise to be remembered. Shelley speaks of the sea as hungering for calm, and in this place one learned to understand the phrase. Looking down into these green waters from the broken edge of the rock, or swimming leisurely in the sunshine, it seemed to me that they were enjoying their own tranquillity, and when now and again it was disturbed by a wind ripple on the surface, or the quick black passage of a fish far below, they settled back again, one could fancy with relief. On shore too, in the little nook of shelter, everything was so subdued and still that the least particular struck in me a pleasurable surprise. The desultory crackling of the wind pods in the afternoon sun usurped the ear. The hot sweet breath of the bank that had been saturated all day long with sunshine and now exhaled it into my face was like the breath of a fellow creature. I remember that I was haunted by 2 lines of French verse. In some dumb way they seemed to fit my surroundings and give expression to the contentment that was in me, and I kept repeating to myself, Mon cœur est un luth suspendu, sitôt qu'on le touche, il résonne. I can give no reason why these lines came to me at this time, and for that very cause I repeat them here. For all I know, they may serve to complete the impression in the mind of the reader, as they were certainly a part of it for me. And this happened to me in the place of all others where I liked least to stay. When I think of it, I grow ashamed of my own ingratitude. Out of the strong came forth sweetness. There, in the bleak and gusty north, I received perhaps my strongest impression of peace. I saw the sea to be great and calm, and the earth in that little corner was all alive and friendly to me. So wherever a man is, he will find something to please and pacify him. In the town he will meet pleasant faces of men and women, and see beautiful flowers at a window, or hear a caged bird singing at the corner of the gloomiest street. And for the country, there is no country without some amenity. Let him only look for it in the right spirit, and he will surely find. Fontainebleau, village communities of painters. The charm of Fontainebleau is a thing apart. It is a place that people love even more than they admire. The vigorous forest air, the silence, the majestic avenues of highway, the wilderness of tumbled boulders, the great age and dignity of certain groves, these are but ingredients. They are not the secret of the filter. The place is sanative. The air, the light, perfumes, and the shapes of things concord in happy harmony. The artist may be idle and not fear the blues. He may dally with his life. Mirth, lyric mirth, and a vivacious classical contentment are of the very essence of the better kind of art, and these, in that most smiling forest, he has the chance to learn or to remember, even on the plain of Biere, where the Angelus of Millet still tolls upon the ear of fancy, a larger air, a higher heaven, something ancient and healthy in the face of nature, purify the mind alike from dullness and hysteria. There is no place where the young are more gladly conscious of their youth, or the old better contented with their age. The fact of its great and special beauty further recommends this country to the artist. The field was chosen by men in whose blood there still raced some of the gleeful or solemn exaltation of great art. Millet, who loved dignity like Michelangelo, Rousseau, whose modern brush was dipped in the glamour of the ancients. It was chosen before the day of that strange turn in the history of art, of which we now perceive the culmination in impressionistic tales and pictures, that voluntary aversion of the eye from all speciously strong and beautiful effects, that disinterested love of dullness which has set so many Peter Bells to paint the riverside primrose. It was then chosen for its proximity to Paris, and for the same cause, and by the force of tradition, the painter of today continues to inhabit and to paint it. There is in France scenery incomparable for romance and harmony. Provence and the valley of the Rhone from Vienne to Tarascon are one succession of masterpieces waiting for the brush. The beauty is not merely beauty. It tells besides a tale to the imagination, and surprises while it charms. Here you shall see castellated towns that would befit the scenery of dreamland, streets that glow with color like cathedral windows, hills of the most exquisite proportions, flowers of every precious color, growing thick like grass. All these, by the grace of railway travel, are brought to the very door of the modern painter. Yet he does not seek them. He remains faithful to Fontainebleau, to the eternal bridge of Gretz, to the watering pot cascade in Cernay. Valley, even Fontainebleau was chosen for him. Even in Fontainebleau he shrinks from what is sharply charactered. But one thing at least is certain: whatever he may choose to paint, and in whatever manner, it is good for the artist to dwell among graceful shapes. Fontainebleau, if it be but quiet scenery, is classically graceful, and though the student may look for different qualities, this quality, silently present, will educate his hand and eye. But before all its other advantages, charm, loveliness, or proximity to Paris, comes the great fact that it is already colonized. The institution of a painter's colony is a work of time and tact. The population must be conquered. The innkeeper has to be taught, and he soon learns the lesson of unlimited credit. He must be taught to welcome as a favored guest a young gentleman in a very greasy coat, and with little baggage beyond a box of colors and a canvas, and he must learn to preserve his faith in customers who will eat heartily and drink of the best, borrow money to buy tobacco, and perhaps not pay a stiver for a year. A color merchant has next to be attracted. A certain vogue must be given to the place, lest the painter, most gregarious of animals, should find himself alone. And no sooner are these first difficulties overcome than fresh perils spring up upon the other side, and the bourgeois and the tourist are knocking at the gate. This is the crucial moment for the colony. If these intruders gain a footing, they not only banish freedom and amenity. Pretty soon, by means of their long purses, they will have undone the education of the innkeeper. Prices will rise and credit shorten, and the poor painter must fare farther on and find another hamlet. Not here, O Apollo, will become his song. Thus Treville and the other day St. Raphael were lost to the arts. Curious, and not always edifying, are the shifts that the French student uses to defend his lair, like the cuttlefish. He must sometimes blacken the waters of his chosen pool, but at such a time and for so practical a purpose, Mrs. Grundy must allow him license. Where his own purse and credit are not threatened, he will do the honors of his village generously. Any artist is made welcome through whatever medium he may seek expression. Science is respected, even the idler, if he prove, as he so rarely does, a gentleman, will soon begin to find himself at home. And when that essentially modern creature, the English or American girl student, began to walk calmly into his favorite inns as if into a drawing room at home, the French painter owned himself defenseless. He submitted or he fled. His French respectability, quite as precise as ours, though covering different provinces of life, recoiled aghast before the innovation. But the girls were painters. There was nothing to be done, and Barbizon, when I last saw it, and for the time at least, was practically ceded to the fair invader. Paterfamilias, on the other hand, the common tourist, the holiday shopman, and the cheap young gentleman upon the spree, he hounded from his villages with every circumstance of contumely. This purely artistic society is excellent for the young artist. The lads are mostly fools. They hold the latest orthodoxy in its crudeness. They are at that stage of education, for the most part, when a man is too much occupied with style to be aware of the necessity for any matter. And this, above all, for the Englishman, is excellent: to work grossly at the trade, to forget sentiment, to think of his material and nothing else, is for a while at least the king's highway of progress. Here in England, too many painters and writers dwell dispersed, unshielded, among the intelligent bourgeois. These, when they are not merely indifferent, pray to him about the lofty aims and moral influence of art, and this is the lad's ruin. For art is, first of all and last of all, a trade. The love of words and not a desire to publish new discoveries, the love of form and not a novel reading of historical events, mark the vocation of the writer and the painter. The arabesque, properly speaking, and even in literature, is the first fancy of the artist. He first plays with his material as a child plays with a kaleidoscope, and he is already in a second stage when he begins to use his pretty counters for the end of representation. In that he must pause long and toil faithfully. That is his apprenticeship, and it is only the few who will really grow beyond it and go forward fully equipped to do the business of real art. To give life to abstractions and significance and charm to facts in the meanwhile, let him dwell much among his fellow craftsmen. They alone can take a serious interest in the childish tasks and pitiful successes of these years. They alone can behold with equanimity this fingering of the dumb keyboard, this polishing of empty sentences, this dull and literal painting of dull and insignificant subjects. Outsiders will spur him on. They will say, "Why do you not write a great book, paint a great picture?" If his guardian angel fail him, they may even persuade him to the attempt, and, 10 to 1, his hand is coarsened and his style falsified for life. And this brings me to a warning. The life of the apprentice to any art is both unstrained and pleasing. It is strewn with small successes in the midst of a career of failure, patiently supported. The heaviest scholar is conscious of a certain progress, and if he come not appreciably near to the art of Shakespeare, grows letter perfect in the domain of ABEAB. But the time comes when a man should cease prelusory gymnastic, stand up, put a violence upon his will, and for better or worse begin the business of creation. This evil day there is a tendency continually to postpone, above all with painters. They have made so many studies that it has become a habit. They make more. The walls of exhibitions blush with them, and death finds these aged students still busy with their hornbook. This class of man finds a congenial home in artist villages, in the slang of the English. Colony at Barbizon, we used to call them snoozers, continual returns to the city, the society of men farther advanced, the study of great works, a sense of humor, or if such a thing is to be had, a little religion or philosophy, are the means of treatment. It will be time enough to think of curing the malady after it has been caught, for to catch it is the very thing for which you seek that dreamland of the painter's village. Snoozing is a part of the artistic education, and the rudiments must be learned stupidly, all else being forgotten, as if they were an object in themselves. Lastly, there is something, or there seems to be something, in the very air of France that communicates the love of style. Precision, clarity, the cleanly and crafty employment of material, a grace in the handling, apart from any value in the thought, seem to be acquired by the mere residents, or if not acquired, become at least the more appreciated. The air of Paris is alive with this technical inspiration, and to leave that airy city and awake next day upon the borders of the forest is but to change externals. The same spirit of dexterity and finish breathes from the long alleys and the lofty groves, from the wildernesses that are still pretty in their confusion, and the great plain that contrives to be decorative in its emptiness, in spite of its really considerable extent. The forest of Fontainebleau is hardly anywhere tedious. I know the whole western side of it with what I suppose I may call thoroughness, well enough at least to testify that there is no square mile without some special character and charm. Such quarters, for instance, as the Long Rocher, the Basse-Brou, and the Reine Blanche might be 100 miles apart. They have scarce a point in common beyond the silence of the birds. The two last are really conterminous, and in both are tall and ancient trees that have outlived 1,000 political vicissitudes, but in the one the great oaks prosper placidly upon an even floor. They beshadow a great field, and the air and the light are very free below their stretching boughs. In the other, the trees find difficult footing. Castles of white rock lie tumbled one upon another, the foot slips, the crooked viper slumbers, the moss clings in the crevice, and above it all the great beech goes spiring and casting forth her arms, and, with a grace beyond church architecture, canopies this rugged chaos. Meanwhile, dividing the two cantons, the broad white causeway of the Paris road runs in an avenue, a road conceived for pageantry and for triumphal marches, an avenue for an army, but its days of glory over, it now lies grilling in the sun between cool groves, and only at intervals the vehicle of the cruising tourist is seen far away and faintly audible along its ample sweep. A little upon one side, and you find a district of sand and birch and boulder. A little upon the other lies the valley of Epремont, all juniper and heather, and close beyond that you may walk into a zone of pine trees. So artfully are the ingredients mingled, nor must it be forgotten that in all this part you come continually forth upon a hilltop, and behold the plain, northward and westward, like an unrefulgent sea, nor that all day long the shadows keep changing, and at last to the red fires of sunset, night succeeds, and with the night a new forest, full of whisper, gloom, and fragrance. There are few things more renovating than to leave Paris, the lamplit arches of the Carrousel, and the long alignment of the glittering streets, and to bathe the senses in this fragrant darkness of the wood. In this continual variety the mind is kept vividly alive. It is a changeful place to paint, a stirring place to live in. As fast as your foot carries you, you pass from scene to scene, each vigorously painted in the colors of the sun, each endeared by that hereditary spell of forests on the mind of man, who still remembers and salutes the ancient refuge of his race. And yet the forest has been civilized throughout. The most savage corners bear a name, and have been cherished like antiquities. In the most remote nature has prepared and balanced her effects, as if with conscious art, and man, with his guiding arrows of blue paint, has countersigned the picture. After your farthest wandering, you are never surprised to come forth upon the vast avenue of highway, to strike the center point of branching alleys, or to find the aqueduct trailing thousand-footed through the brush. It is not a wilderness, it is rather a preserve, and fitly enough, the center of the maze is not a hermit's cavern. In the midst, a little mirthful town lies sunlit, humming with the business of pleasure, and the palace, breathing distinction and peopled by historic names, stands smokeless among gardens. Perhaps the last attempt at savage life was that of the harmless humbug who called himself the hermit. In a great tree, close by the high road, he had built himself a little cabin, after the manner of the Swiss family Robinson. Thither he mounted at night by the romantic aid of a rope ladder, and if dirt be any proof of sincerity, the man was savage as a Sioux. I had the pleasure of his acquaintance. He appeared grossly stupid, not in his perfect wits, and interested in nothing but small change. For that he had a great avidity. In the course of time he proved to be a chicken stealer, and vanished from his perch. And perhaps from the first he was no true votary of forest freedom, but an ingenious, theatrically minded beggar, and his cabin in the tree was only stock in trade to beg withal. The choice of his position would seem to indicate so much, for if in the forest there are no places still to be discovered, there are many that have been forgotten, and that lie unvisited there. To be sure are the blue arrows waiting to reconduct you, now blazed upon a tree, now posted in the corner of a rock. But your security from interruption is complete. You might camp for weeks if there were only water, and not a soul suspect your presence. And if I may suppose the reader to have committed some great crime and come to me for aid, I think I could still find my way to a small cavern, fitted with a hearth and chimney, where he might lie perfectly concealed. A Confederate landscape painter might daily supply him with food. For water, he would have to make a nightly tramp as far as to the nearest pond. And at last, when the hue and cry began to blow over, he might get gently on the train at some side station, work round by a series of junctions, and be quietly captured at the frontier. Thus, Fontainebleau, although it is truly but a pleasure ground, and although in favorable weather and in the more celebrated quarters, it literally buzzes with the tourist, yet has some of the immunities and offers some of the repose of natural forests. And the solitary, although he must return at night to his frequented inn, may yet pass the day with his own thoughts in the companionable silence of the trees. The demands of the imagination vary. Some can be alone in a back garden looked upon by windows. Others, like the ostrich, are content with a solitude that meets the eye, and others again expand in fancy to the very borders of their desert, and are irritably conscious of a hunter's camp in an adjacent county. To these last, of course, Fontainebleau will seem but an extended tea-garden, a Rocheville on a by-day, but to the plain man it offers solitude, an excellent thing in itself, and a good whet for company, I was for some time a consistent Barbizonian, et ego in Arcadia Vixi, it was a pleasant season. And that noiseless hamlet lying close among the borders of the wood is for me, as for so many others, a green spot in memory. The great Millet was just dead. The green shutters of his modest house were closed. His daughters were in mourning. The date of my first visit was thus an epoch in the history of art. In a lesser way, it was an epoch in the history of the Latin Quarter. The Petit Cenacle was dead and buried. Murger and his crew of sponging vagabonds were all at rest from their expedients. The tradition of their real life was nearly lost, and the petrified legend of the Vie de Bohème had become a sort of gospel, and still gave the cue to zealous imitators. But if the book be written in rose water, the imitation was still farther expurgated. Honesty was the rule. The innkeepers gave, as I have said, almost unlimited credit. They suffered the seediest painter to depart, to take all his belongings, and to leave his bill unpaid. And if they sometimes lost, it was by English and Americans alone. At the same time, the great influx of Anglo-Saxons had begun to affect the life of the studious. There had been disputes, and in one instance at least, the English and the Americans had made common cause to prevent a cruel pleasantry. It would be well if nations and races could communicate their qualities, but in practice, when they look upon each other, they have an eye to nothing but defects. The Anglo-Saxon is essentially dishonest. The French is devoid by nature of the principle that we call fair play. The Frenchman marveled at the scruples of his guest, and when that defender of innocence retired overseas and left his bills unpaid, he marveled once again. The good and evil were, in his eyes, part and parcel of the same eccentricity. A shrug expressed his judgment upon both. At Barbizon there was no master, no pontiff in the arts. Palissy bore rule at Gretz, Urbane, superior rule, his memory rich in anecdotes of the great men of yore, his mind fertile in theories, sceptical, composed, and venerable to the eye, and yet beneath these outworks, all twittering with Italian superstition, his eye scouting for omens, and the whole fabric of his manners giving way on the appearance of a hunchback. Cernay had Pelouse, the admirable placid Pelouse, smilingly critical of youth, who, when a full-blown commercial traveller, suddenly threw down his samples, bought a colour box, and became the master whom we have all admired. Marlot for a central figure, boasted Olivier de Pen. Only Barbizon, since the death of Millet, was a headless commonwealth, even its secondary lights, and those who in my day made the stranger welcome have since deserted it. The good La Chèvre has departed, carrying his household gods, and long before that Gaston La Fenestre was taken from our midst by an untimely death. He died before he had deserved success. It may be he would never have deserved it, but his kind, comely, modest countenance still haunts the memory of all who knew him. Another, whom I will not name, has moved farther on, pursuing the strange odyssey of his decadence. His days of royal favour had departed even then, but he still retained in his narrower life at Barbizon a certain stamp of conscious importance, hardy, friendly, filling the room, the occupant of several chairs. Nor had he yet ceased his losing battle, still labouring upon great canvases that none would buy, still waiting the return of fortune. But these days also were too good to last, and the former favourite of two sovereigns fled, if I heard the truth by night. There was a time when he was counted a great man, and Millet but a dauber. Behold how the whirligig of time brings in his revenges. To pity Millet is a piece of arrogance. If life be hard for such resolute and pious spirits, it is harder still for us, had we the wit to understand it. But we may pity his unhappy arrival, who, for no apparent merit, was raised to opulence and momentary fame, and through no apparent fault was suffered step by step to sink again to nothing. No misfortune can exceed the bitterness of such back foremost progress, even bravely supported as it was, but to those also who were taken early from the easel, a regret is due. From all the young men of this period, one stood out by the vigour of his promise. He was, in the age of fermentation, enamoured of eccentricities. Il faut faire de la peinture nouvelle was his watchword. But if time and experience had continued his education, if he had been granted health to return from these excursions to the steady and the central, I must believe that the name of Hills had become famous. Siren's Inn, that excellent artist's barrack, was managed upon easy principles at any hour of the night when you returned from wandering in the forest. You went to the billiard room and helped yourself to liquors, or descended to the cellar and returned laden with beer or wine. The Sarans were all locked in slumber. There was none to check your inroads. Only at the week's end a computation was made. The gross sum was divided, and a varying share set down to every lodger's name under the rubric, estrates. Upon the more long-suffering the larger tax was levied, and your bill lengthened in a direct proportion to the easiness of your disposition. At any hour of the morning, again, you could get your coffee or cold milk and set forth into the forest. The doves had perhaps wakened you, fluttering into your chamber, and on the threshold of the inn you were met by the aroma of the forest. Close by were the great aisles, the mossy boulders, the interminable field of forest shadow. There you were, free to dream and wander, and at noon, and again at 6 o'clock, a good meal awaited you on Siron's table. The whole of your accommodation, set aside that varying item of the estrels, cost you 5 francs a day. Your bill was never offered you until you asked it, and if you were out of luck's way, you might depart for where you pleased and leave it pending. Theoretically, the house was open to all comers. Practically, it was a kind of club. The guests protected themselves, and in so doing, they protected Siron. Formal manners being laid aside, essential courtesy was the more rigidly exacted. The new arrival had to feel the pulse of the society, and a breach of its undefined observances was promptly punished. A man might be as plain, as dull, as slovenly, as free of speech as he desired, but to a touch of presumption or a word of hectoring these free Barbizonians were as sensitive as a tea-party of maiden ladies. I have seen people driven forth from Barbizon. It would be difficult to say in words what they had done, but they deserved their fate. They had shown themselves unworthy to enjoy these corporate freedoms. They had pushed themselves, they had made their head, they wanted tact to appreciate the fine shades of Barbizonian etiquette. And once they were condemned, the process of extrusion was ruthless in its cruelty. After one evening with the formidable Bodmer, the bailey of our commonwealth, the erring stranger was beheld no more. He rose exceeding early the next day, and the first coach conveyed him from the scene of his discomfiture. These sentences of banishment were never, in my knowledge, delivered against an artist. Such would, I believe, have been illegal, but the odd and pleasant fact is this, that they were never needed. Painters, sculptors, writers, singers, I have seen all of these in Barbizon, and some were sulky, and some blatant and inane, but one and all entered at once into the spirit of the association. This singular society is purely French, a creature of French virtues, and possibly of French defects. It cannot be imitated by the English. The roughness, the impatience, the more obvious selfishness, and even the more ardent friendships of the Anglo-Saxon speedily dismember such a commonwealth. But this random gathering of young French painters, with neither apparatus nor parade of government, yet kept the life of the place upon a certain footing, insensibly imposed their etiquette upon the docile, and by caustic speech enforced their edicts against the unwelcome. To think of it is to wonder the more at this strange failure of their race upon the larger theatre. This inbred civility, to use the word in its completest meaning, this natural and facile adjustment of contending liberties, seems all that is required to make a governable nation and a just and prosperous country. Our society thus, purged and guarded, was full of high spirits, of laughter, and of the initiative of youth. The few elder men who joined us were still young at heart, and took the key from their companions. We returned from long stations in the fortifying air, our blood renewed by the sunshine, our spirits refreshed by the silence of the forest. The babel of loud voices sounded good. We fell to eat and play like the natural man, and in the high-end chamber, panelled with indifferent pictures and lit by candles guttering in the night air, the talk and laughter sounded far into the night. It was a good place and a good life for any naturally minded youth. Better yet for the student of painting, and perhaps best of all for the student of letters. He too was saturated in this atmosphere of style. He was shut out from the disturbing currents of the world. He might forget that there existed other and more pressing interests than that of art. But in such a place it was hardly possible to write. He could not drug his conscience like the painter by the production of listless studies. He saw himself idle among many who were apparently, and some who were really, employed. And what with the impulse of increasing health and the continual provocation of romantic scenes, he became tormented with the desire to work. He enjoyed a strenuous idleness full of visions, hearty meals, long sweltering walks, mirth among companions, and still floating like music through his brain, foresights of great works that Shakespeare might be proud to have conceived, headless epics, glorious torsos of dramas, and words that were alive with import. So in youth, like Moses from the mountain, we have sights of that house beautiful of art, which we shall never enter. They are dreams and unsubstantial, visions of style that repose upon no base of human meaning. The last heart-throbs of that excited amateur who has to die in all of us before the artist can be born. But they come to us in such a rainbow of glory that all subsequent achievement appears dull and earthly in comparison. We were all artists, almost all in the age of illusion, cultivating an imaginary genius, and walking to the strains of some deceiving Ariel. Small wonder, indeed, if we were happy. But art of whatever nature is a kind mistress, and though these dreams of youth fall by their own baselessness, others succeed, graver and more substantial. The symptoms change, the amiable malady endures, and still, at an equal distance, the house beautiful shines upon its hilltop. Gretz lies out of the forest, down by the bright river. It boasts a mill, an ancient church, a castle, and a bridge of many sterlings, and the bridge is a piece of public property, anonymously famous, beaming on the incurious dilettanti from the walls of 100 exhibitions. I have seen it in the Salon, I have seen it in the Academy, I have seen it in the last French Exposition, excellently done by Bloomer. In a black and white by Mr. A. Henley, it once adorned this essay in the pages of the magazine of art, Long-Suffering Bridge. And if you visit Gretz tomorrow, you shall find another generation camped at the bottom of Chevillon's garden under their white umbrellas, and doggedly painting it again. The bridge taken for granted, Gretz is a less inspiring place than Barbizon. I give it the palm over Cernay. There is something ghastly in the great empty village square of Cernay, with the inn tables standing in one corner as though the stage were set for rustic opera, and in the early morning all the painters breaking their fast upon white wine under the windows of the villagers. It is vastly different to awake in Gretz, to go down the green inn garden, to find the river streaming through the bridge, and to see the dawn begin across the poplared level. The meals are laid in the cool arbor, under fluttering leaves. The splash of oars and bathers, the bathing costumes out to dry, trim canoes beside the jetty, tell of a society that has an eye to pleasure. There is something to do at Gretz, perhaps for that very reason. I can recall no such enduring ardors, no such glories of exhilaration, as among the solemn groves and uneventful hours of Barbizon. This something to do is a great enemy to joy. It is a way out of it. You wreak your high spirits on some cut and dry employment, and behold them gone. But Gretz is a merry place after its kind, pretty to see, merry to inhabit. The course of its pellucid river, whether up or down, is full of gentle attractions for the navigator, islanded reed mazes, where in autumn the red berries cluster, the mirrored and inverted images of trees, lilies and mills, and the foam and thunder of weirs, and of all noble sweeps of roadway, none is nobler, on a windy dusk, than the high road to Nemours, between its lines of talking poplar. But even Gretz is changed. The old inn, long-shored and trussed and buttressed, fell at length under the mere weight of years, and the place as it was is but a fading image in the memory of former guests. They indeed recall the ancient wooden stair, they recall the rainy evening, the wide hearth, the blaze of the twig fire, and the company that gathered round the pillar in the kitchen. But the material fabric is now dust. Soon, with the last of its inhabitants, its very memory shall follow, and they, in their turn, shall suffer the same law, and both in name and lineament vanish from the world of men. For remembrance of the old house sake, as Pepys once quaintly put it, let me tell one story. When the tide of invasion swept over France, 2 foreign painters were left stranded and penniless in Gretz, and there, until the war was over, the Chevillons ungrudgingly harbored them. It was difficult to obtain supplies, but the two waifs were still welcome to the best, sat down daily with the family to table, and at the due intervals were supplied with clean napkins which they scrupled to employ. Madame Chevillon observed the fact and reprimanded them, but they stood firm, eat they must, but having no money they would soil no napkins. Nemours and Moret, for all they are so picturesque, have been little visited by painters. They are indeed too populous, they have manners of their own, and might resist the drastic process of colonization. Montigny has been somewhat strangely neglected. I never knew it inhabited, but once, when Will H. Lowe installed himself there with a barrel of piquet, and entertained his friends in a leafy trellis above the weir, in sight of the green country, and to the music of the falling water, it was a most airy, quaint, and pleasant place of residence, just too rustic to be stagey, and from my memories of the place in general, and that garden trellis in particular, at morning, visited by birds, or at night when the dew fell, and the stars were of the party, I'm inclined to think, perhaps too favourably, of the future of Montigny. Cælium Biare has outlived all things, and lies dustily slumbering in the plain, the cemetery of itself. The great road remains to testify of its former bustle of postilions and carriage bells, and, like memorial tablets, there still hang in the inn-room the paintings of a former generation, dead or decorated long ago. In my time one man only, greatly daring, dwelt there. From time to time he would walk over to Barbizon, like a shade revisiting the glimpses of the moon, and after some communication with flesh and blood return to his austere hermit age. But even he, when I last revisited the forest, had come to Barbizon for good, and closed the roll of Chaelites. It may revive, but I much doubt it. Achères and recloses still wait a pioneer. Bouron is out of the question, being merely Gretz over again, without the river, the bridge, or the beauty. And of all the possible places on the western side, Marlot alone remains to be discussed. I scarcely know Marlot, and very likely for that reason I'm not much in love with it. It seems a glaring and unsightly. Hamlet, the inn of Mother Antony, is unattractive, and its more reputable rival, though comfortable enough, is commonplace. Marlot has a name. It is famous. If I were the young painter I would leave it alone in its glory. These are the words of an old stager, and though time is a good conservative in forest places, much may be untrue today. Many of us have passed Arcadian days there and moved on, but yet left a portion of our souls behind us buried in the woods. I would not dig for these reliquiae. They are incommunicable treasures that will not enrich the finder, and yet there may lie, interred below great oaks or scattered along forest paths, stores of youth's dynamite and dear remembrances. And as one generation passes on and renovates the field of tillage for the next, I entertain a fancy that when the young men of today go forth into the forest, they shall find the air still vitalized by the spirits of their predecessors, and like those unheard melodies that are the sweetest of all, the memory of our laughter shall still haunt the field of trees. Those merry voices that in woods call the wanderer farther, those thrilling silences and whispers of the groves, surely in Fontainebleau they must be vocal of me and my companions. We are not content to pass away entirely from the scenes of our delight. We would leave, if but in gratitude, a pillar and a legend. One generation after another fall like honeybees upon this memorable forest, rifle its sweets, pack themselves with vital memories, and when the theft is consummated depart again into life richer, but poorer also. The forest indeed they have possessed from that day forward. It is theirs indissolubly, and they will return to walk in it at night in the fondest of their dreams, and use it forever in their books and pictures. Yet when they made their packets and put up their notes and sketches, something, it should seem, had been forgotten. A projection of themselves shall appear to haunt unfriended these scenes of happiness, a natural child of fancy, begotten and forgotten unawares. Over the whole field of our wandering such fetches are still travelling like indefatigable bagmen, but the imps of Fontainebleau, as of all beloved spots, are very long of life, and memory is piously unwilling to forget their orphanage. If anywhere about that wood you meet my airy bantling, greet him with tenderness. He was a pleasant lad, though now abandoned, and when it comes to your own turn to quit the forest, may you leave behind you such another. No Antony or Werther, let us hope, no tearful whipster, but as becomes this not uncheerful and most active age in which we figure the child of happy hours, no art. it may be said, was ever perfect, and not many noble, that has not been mirthfully conceived. And no man, it may be added, was ever anything but a wet blanket and a cross to his companions, who boasted not a copious spirit of enjoyment. Whether as man or artist, let the youth make haste to Fontainebleau, and once there let him address himself to the spirit of the place. He will learn more from exercise than from studies, although both are necessary, and if he can get into his heart the gaiety and inspiration of the woods, he will have gone far to undo the evil of his sketches. A spirit once well strung up to the concert pitch of the primeval, out of doors will hardly dare to finish a study and magniloquently ticketed a picture. The incommunicable thrill of things, that is the tuning fork, by which we test the flatness of our art here. It is that nature teaches and condemns, and still spurs us to further effort and new failure. Thus it is that she sets us blushing at our ignorant and tepid works, and the more we find of these inspiring shocks, the less shall we be apt to love the literal in our productions. In all sciences and senses the letter kills, and today, when cackling human geese express their ignorant condemnation of all studio pictures, it is a lesson most useful to be learnt. Let the young painter go to Fontainebleau, and while he stupefies himself with studies that teach him the mechanical side of his trade, let him walk in the great air and be a servant of mirth, and not pick and botanize, but wait upon the moods of nature, so he will learn or learn not to forget the poetry of life and earth, which, when he has acquired his track, will save him from joyless reproduction. The old Pacific capital, the woods and the Pacific. The Bay of Monterey has been compared by no less a person than General Sherman to a bent fishing hook, and the comparison, if less important than the march through Georgia, still shows the eye of a soldier for topography. Santa Cruz sits exposed at the shank. The mouth of the Salinas River is at the middle of the bend, and Monterey itself is cozily ensconced beside the Bob. Thus the ancient capital of California faces across the bay, while the Pacific Ocean, though hidden by low hills and forest, bombards her left flank and rear with never-dying surf. In front of the town, the long line of sea beach trends north and northwest, and then westward to enclose the bay. The waves, which lap so quietly about the jetties of Monterey, grow louder and larger in the distance. You can see the breakers leaping high and white by day. At night, the outline of the shore is traced in transparent silver by the moonlight and the flying foam, and from all round, even in quiet weather, the distant, thrilling roar of the Pacific hangs over the coast and the adjacent country like smoke above a battle. These long beaches are enticing to the idle man. It would be hard to find a walk more solitary and at the same time more exciting to the mind. Crowds of ducks and seagulls hover over the sea. Sandpipers trot in and out by troops after the retiring waves, trilling together in a chorus of infinitesimal song. Strange sea tangles, new to the European eye, the bones of whales or sometimes a whole whale's carcase, white with carrion gulls and poisoning the wind, lie scattered here and there along the sands. The waves come in slowly, vast and green, curve their translucent necks, and burst with a surprising uproar that runs, waxing and waning, up and down the long keyboard of the beach. The foam of these great ruins mounts in an instant to the ridge of the sand glacis, swiftly fleets back again, and is met and buried by the next breaker. The interest is perpetually fresh. On no other coast that I know shall you enjoy, in calm, sunny weather, such a spectacle of ocean's greatness, such beauty of changing colour, or such degrees of thunder in the sound. The very air is more than usually salt by this Homeric deep. Inshore, a tract of sandhills borders on the beach. Here and there, a lagoon, more or less brackish, attracts the birds and hunters. A rough undergrowth partially conceals the sand. The crouching, hardy live oaks flourish singly or in thickets, the kind of wood for murderers to crawl among, and here and there the skirts of the forest extend downward from the hills with a floor of turf and long aisles of pine trees hung with Spaniard's beard. Through this quaint desert, the railway cars drew near to Monterey from the junction at Salinas City, though that and so many other things are now forever altered, and it was from here that you had the first view of the old township lying in the sands, its white windmills bickering in the chill, perpetual wind, and the first fogs of the evening drawing drearily around it from the sea. The one common note of all this country is the haunting presence of the ocean. A great faint sound of breakers follows you high up into the inland canyons. The roar of water dwells in the clean, empty rooms of Monterey as in a shell upon the chimney. Go where you will, you have but to pause and listen to hear the voice of the Pacific. You pass out of the town to the southwest and mount the hill among pine woods. Glade, thicket, and grove surround you. You follow winding sandy tracks that lead now hither. You see a deer. A multitude of quail arises, but the sound of the sea still follows you as you advance, like that of wind. Among the trees only harsher and stranger to the ear, and when at length you gain the summit, out breaks on every hand and with freshened vigor that same unending, distant whispering rumble of the ocean. For now you are on the top of Monterey Peninsula, and the noise no longer only mounts to you from behind along the beach towards Santa Cruz, but from your right, also round by Chinatown and Pinos Lighthouse, and from down before you to the mouth of the Carmelo River. The whole woodland is begirt with thundering surges. The silence that immediately surrounds you where you stand is not so much broken as it is haunted by this distant, circling rumor. It sets your senses upon edge. You strain your attention. You are clearly and unusually conscious of small sounds near at hand. You walk listening like an Indian hunter, and that voice of the Pacific is a sort of disquieting company to you in your walk. When once I was in these woods, I found it difficult to turn homeward. All woods lure a rambler onward. But in those of Monterey, it was the surf that particularly invited me to prolong my walks. I would push straight for the shore where I thought it to be nearest. Indeed, there was scarce a direction that would not, sooner or later, have brought me forth on the Pacific. The emptiness of the woods gave me a sense of freedom and discovery in these excursions. I never in all my visits met but one man. He was a Mexican, very dark of hue, but smiling and fat, and he carried an axe, though his true business at that moment was to seek for straying cattle. I asked him what o'clock it was, but he seemed neither to know nor care, and when he in his turn asked me for news of his cattle, I showed myself equally indifferent. We stood and smiled upon each other for a few seconds, and then turned without a word and took our several ways across the forest. One day, I shall never forget it, I had taken a trail that was new to me. After a while, the woods began to open the sea to sound nearer at hand. I came upon a road, and to my surprise, a stile a step or two farther, and without leaving the woods, I found myself among trim houses. I walked through street after street, parallel and at right angles, paved with sward and dotted with trees, but still undeniable streets, and each with its name posted at the corner, as in a real town. Facing down the main thoroughfare, Central Avenue as it was ticketed, I saw an open-air temple with benches and sounding board, as though for an orchestra. The houses were all tightly shuttered. There was no smoke, no sound but of the waves, no moving thing. I have never been in any place that seemed so dreamlike. Pompeii is all in a bustle with visitors, and its antiquity and strangeness deceive the imagination, but this town had plainly not been built above a year or two, and perhaps had been deserted overnight. Indeed, it was not so much like a deserted town as like a scene upon the stage by daylight and with no one on the boards. The barking of a dog led me at last to the only house still occupied, where a Scotch pastor and his wife passed the winter alone in this empty theatre. The place was the Pacific Campgrounds, the Christian seaside resort. Thither, in the warm season, crowds come to enjoy a life of teetotalism, religion, and flirtation, which I am willing to think blameless and agreeable. The neighborhood, at least, is well selected. The Pacific booms in front. Westward is Point Pinos, with the lighthouse in a wilderness of sand where you will find the lightkeeper playing the piano, making models and bows and arrows, studying dawn and sunrise in amateur oil painting, and with a dozen other elegant pursuits and interests to surprise his brave old country rivals. To the east and still nearer, you will come upon a space of open down, a hamlet, a haven among rocks, a world of surge and screaming seagulls. Such scenes are very similar in different climates. They appear homely to the eyes of all. To me this was like a dozen spots in Scotland, and yet the boats that ride in the haven are of strange outlandish design, and if you walk into the hamlet you will behold costumes and faces and hear a tongue that are unfamiliar to the memory. The joss stick burns, the opium pipe is smoked, the floors are strewn with slips of colored paper, prayers, you would say, that had somehow missed their destination, and a man guiding his upright pencil from right to left across the sheet writes home the news of Monterey to the Celestial Empire. The woods and the Pacific rule between them the climate of this seaboard region. On the streets of Monterey, when the air does not smell salt from the one, it will be blowing perfumed from the resinous treetops of the other, for days together. A hot, dry air will overhang the town, close as from an oven, yet healthful and aromatic in the nostrils. The cause is not far to seek, for the woods are afire, and the hot wind is blowing from the hills. These fires are one of the great dangers of California. I have seen from Monterey as many as 3 at the same time, by day a cloud of smoke, by night a red coal of conflagration in the distance. A little thing will start them, and if the wind be favorable, they gallop over miles of country faster than a horse. The inhabitants must turn out and work like demons, for it is not only the pleasant groves that are destroyed, the climate and the soil are equally at stake, and these fires prevent the rains of the next winter and dry up perennial fountains. California has been a land of promise in its time, like Palestine, but if the woods continue so swiftly to perish, it may become like Palestine, a land of desolation. To visit the woods while they are languidly burning is a strange piece of experience. The fire passes through the underbrush at a run. Every here and there a tree flares up instantaneously from root to summit, scattering tufts of flame, and is quenched, it seems, as quickly. But this last is only in semblance, for after this first squib-like conflagration of the dry moss and twigs, there remains behind a deep-rooted and consuming fire in the very entrails of the tree. The resin of the pitch pine is principally condensed at the base of the bole and in the spreading roots. Thus, after the light, showy, skirmishing flames, which are only as the match to the explosion, have already scampered down the wind into the distance. The true harm is but beginning for this giant of the woods. You may approach the tree from one side and see it scorched indeed from top to bottom, but apparently survivor of the peril, make the circuit, and there on the other side of the column is a clear mass of living coal, spreading like an ulcer, while underground to their most extended fibre, the roots are being eaten out by fire, and the smoke is rising through the fissures to the surface. A little while, and without a nod of warning, the huge pine tree snaps off short across the ground and falls prostrate with a crash. Meanwhile, the fire continues its silent business. The roots are reduced to a fine ash, and long afterwards, if you pass by, you will find the earth pierced with radiating galleries, and preserving the design of all these subterranean spurs, as though it were the mould for a new tree instead of the print of an old one. These pitch pines of Monterey are, with the single exception of the Monterey cypress, the most fantastic of forest trees. No words can give an idea of the contortion of their growth. They might figure without change in a circle of the nether hell as Dante pictured it, and at the rate at which trees grow and at which forest fires spring up and gallop through the hills of California, we may look forward to a time when there will not be one of them left standing in that land of their nativity. At least they have not so much to fear from the axe, but perish by what may be called a natural, although a violent death. While it is man, in his short-sighted greed, that robs the country of the nobler redwood, yet a little while, and perhaps all the hills of seaboard California may be as bald as Tamalpais. I have an interest of my own in these forest fires, for I came so near to lynching on one occasion, that a braver man might have retained a thrill from the experience. I wish to be certain whether it was the moss, that quaint funereal ornament of Californian forests, which blazed up so rapidly when the flame first touched the tree. I suppose I must have been under the influence of Satan, for instead of plucking off a piece for my experiment, what should I do but walk up to a great pine tree in a portion of the wood which had escaped so much as scorching, strike a match, and apply the flame gingerly to one of the tassels. The tree went off simply like a rocket. In 3 seconds it was a roaring pillar of fire. Close by I could hear the shouts of those who were at work combating the original conflagration. I could see the wagon that had brought them tied to a live oak in a piece of open. I could even catch the flash of an axe as it swung up through the underwood into the sunlight. Had anyone observed the result of my experiment, my neck was literally not worth a pinch of snuff after a few minutes of passionate expostulation. I should have been run up to a convenient bough. To die for faction is a common evil, but to be hanged for nonsense is the devil. I have run repeatedly, but never as I ran that day. At night I went out of town, and there was my own particular fire quite distinct from the other, and burning, as I thought, with even greater vigor. But it is the Pacific that exercises the most direct and obvious power upon the climate. At sunset for months together, vast, wet, melancholy fogs arise and come shoreward from the ocean. From the hilltop above Monterey the scene is often noble, although it is always sad. The upper air is still bright with sunlight. A glow still rests upon the Gabilano peak. but the fogs are in possession of the lower levels. They crawl in scarves among the sand hills. They float a little higher in clouds of a gigantic size and often of a wild configuration to the south, where they have struck the seaward shoulder of the mountains of Santa Lucia. They double back and spire up skyward like smoke. Where their shadow touches, color dies out of the world. The air grows chill and deadly as they advance. The trade wind freshens, the trees begin to sigh, and all the windmills in Monterey are whirling and creaking and filling their cisterns with the brackish water of the sands. It takes but a little while till the invasion is complete. The sea, in its lighter order, has submerged the earth. Monterey is curtained in for the night in thick, wet, salt, and frigid clouds, so to remain till day returns, and before the sun's rays they slowly disperse and retreat in broken squadrons to the bosom of the sea. And yet often when the fog is thickest and most chill, a few steps out of the town and up the slope, the night will be dry and warm and full of inland perfume. Mexicans, Americans, and Indians. The history of Monterey has yet to be written, founded by Catholic missionaries, a place of wise beneficence to Indians, a place of alms, a Mexican capital continually wrested by one faction from another, an American capital when the first House of Representatives held its deliberations, and then falling lower and lower from the capital of the state to the capital of a county, and from that again by the loss of its charter and town lands to a mere bankrupt village. Its rise and decline is typical of that of all Mexican institutions and even Mexican families in California. Nothing is stranger in that strange state than the rapidity with which the soil has changed hands. The Mexicans, you may say, are all poor and landless, like their former capital, and yet both it and they hold themselves apart and preserve their ancient customs and something of their ancient air. The town, when I was there, was a place of 2 or 3 streets, economically paved with sea sand, and 2 or 3 lanes, which were watercourses in the rainy season, and were at all times rent up by fishers 4 or 5 feet deep. There were no street lights. Short sections of wooden sidewalk only added to the dangers of the night, for they were often high above the level of the roadway, and no one could tell where they would be likely to begin or end. The houses were, for the most part, built of unbaked adobe brick, many of them old for so new a country, some of very elegant proportions, with low, spacious, shapely rooms, and walls so thick that the heat of summer never dried them to the heart. At the approach of the rainy season a deathly chill, and a graveyard smell began to hang about the lower floors, and diseases of the chest are common and fatal among housekeeping people of either sex. There was no activity but in and around the saloons, where people sat almost all day long playing cards. The smallest excursion was made on horseback. You would scarcely ever see the main street without a horse or two tied to posts, and making a fine figure with their Mexican housings. It struck me oddly to come across some of the Cornhill illustrations to Mr. Blackmore's Erema, and see all the characters astride on English saddles. As a matter of fact, an English saddle is a rarity even in San Francisco, and you may say a thing unknown in all the rest of California. In a place so exclusively Mexican as Monterey, you saw not only Mexican saddles, but true vaquero riding, men always at the hand gallop, up hill and down dale, and round the sharpest corner, urging their horses with cries and gesticulations, and cruel rotatory spurs, checking them dead with a touch, or wheeling them right about face in a square yard. The type of face and character of bearing are surprisingly un-American. The first ranged from something like the pure Spanish to something in its sad fixity not unlike the pure Indian, although I do not suppose there was one pure blood of either race in all the country. As for the second, it was a matter of perpetual surprise to find, in that world of absolutely mannerless Americans, a people full of deportment, solemnly courteous, and doing all things with grace and decorum. In dress they ran to color and bright sashes. Not even the most Americanized could always resist the temptation to stick a red rose into his hatband. Not even the most Americanized would descend to wear the vile dress hat of civilization. Spanish was the language of the streets. It was difficult to get along without a word or two of that language for an occasion. The only communications in which the population joined were with a view to amusement. A weekly public ball took place with great etiquette. In addition to the numerous fandangos in private houses, there was a really fair amateur brass band. Night after night serenaders would be going about the street, sometimes in a company and with several instruments and voiced together, sometimes severally, each guitar before a different window. It was a strange thing to lie awake in 19th century America, and hear the guitar accompany, and one of these old heartbreaking Spanish love songs mount into the night air, perhaps in a deep baritone, perhaps in that high-pitched, pathetic, womanish alto, which is so common among Mexican men, and which strikes on the unaccustomed ear as something not entirely human but altogether sad. The town, then, was essentially and wholly Mexican, and yet almost all the land in the neighborhood was held by Americans, and it was from the same class, numerically so small, that the principal officials were selected. This Mexican and that Mexican would describe to you his old family estates, not one rood of which remained to him. You would ask him how that came about, and elicit some tangled story back foremost, from which you gathered that the Americans had been greedy like designing men, and the Mexicans greedy like children, but no other certain fact. Their merits and their faults contributed alike to the ruin of the former landholders. It is true they were improvident and easily dazzled with the sight of ready money, but they were gentlefolk besides, and that in a way which curiously unfitted them to combat Yankee craft. Suppose they have a paper to sign, they would think it a reflection on the other party to examine the terms with any great minuteness. Nay, suppose them to observe some doubtful clause, it is 10 to 1 they would refuse from delicacy to object to it. I know I am speaking within the mark, for I have seen such a case occur, and the Mexican, in spite of the advice of his lawyer, has signed the imperfect paper like a lamb. To have spoken in the matter, he said, above all to have let the other party guess that he had seen a lawyer, would have been like doubting his word. The scruple sounds oddly to one of ourselves, who have been brought up to understand all business as a competition in fraud, and honesty itself to be a virtue which regards the carrying out, but not the creation of agreements. This single unworldly trait will account for much of that revolution of which we are speaking. The Mexicans have the name of being great swindlers, but certainly the accusation cuts both ways. In a contest of this sort, the entire booty would scarcely have passed into the hands of the more scrupulous race. Physically, the Americans have triumphed, but it is not entirely seen how far they have themselves been morally conquered. This is, of course, but a part of an extraordinary problem now, in the course of being solved in the various states of the American Union. I'm reminded of an anecdote. Some years ago, at a great sale of wine, all the odd lots were purchased by a grocer in a small way in the old town of Edinburgh. The agent had the curiosity to visit him some time after and inquire what possible use he could have for such material. He was shown by way of answer a huge vat where all the liquors from humble Gladstone to Imperial Tokay were fermenting together, and what he asked, "Do you propose to call this?" "I'm no very sure," replied the grocer, "but I think it's going to turn out port. In the older eastern states, I think we may say that this hodgepodge of races is going to turn out English or thereabout, but the problem is indefinitely varied in other zones. The elements are differently mingled in the south in what we may call the territorial belt, and in the group of states on the Pacific coast. Above all, in these last we may look to see some monstrous hybrid, whether good or evil, who shall forecast, but certainly original and all their own. In my little restaurant at Monterey, we have sat down to table day after day a Frenchman, 2 Portuguese, an Italian, a Mexican, and a Scotchman. We had for common visitors an American from Illinois, a nearly pure-blood Indian woman, and a naturalized Chinese, and from time to time a Switzer and a German came down from country ranches for the night. No wonder that the Pacific coast is a foreign land to visitors from the eastern states, for each race contributes something of its own. Even the despised Chinese have taught the youth of California, none indeed of their virtues, but the debasing use of opium, and chief among these influences is that of the Mexicans. The Mexicans, although in the state are out of it, they still preserve a sort of international independence, and keep their affairs snug to themselves. Only 4 or 5 years ago, Vasquez, the bandit, his troops being dispersed and the hunt too hot for him in other parts of California, returned to his native Monterey, and was seen publicly in her streets and saloons, fearing no man. The year that I was there occurred 2 reputed murders, as the Montereyans are exceptionally vile speakers of each other and of everyone behind his back. It is not possible for me to judge how much truth there may have been in these reports, but in the one case everyone believed, and in the other some suspected, that there had been foul play, and nobody dreamed for an instant of taking the authorities into their counsel. Now this is of course characteristic enough of the Mexicans, but it is a noteworthy feature that all the Americans in Monterey acquiesced without a word in this inaction. Even when I spoke to them upon the subject, They seemed not to understand my surprise. They had forgotten the traditions of their own race and upbringing, and become, in a word, wholly Mexicanized. Again, the Mexicans, having no ready money to speak of, rely almost entirely in their business transactions upon each other's worthless paper. Pedro the penniless pays you with an IOU from the equally penniless Miguel. It is a sort of local currency by courtesy. Credit in these parts has passed into a superstition. I have seen a strong, violent man struggling for months to recover a debt and getting nothing but an exchange of waste paper. The very storekeepers are averse to asking for cash payments and are more surprised than pleased when they are offered. They fear there must be something under it, and that you mean to withdraw your custom from them. I have seen the enterprising chemist and stationer begging me with fervor to let my account run on, although I had my purse open in my hand, and partly from the commonness of the case, partly from some remains of that generous old Mexican tradition which made all men welcome to their tables, a person may be notoriously both unwilling and unable to pay, and still find credit for the necessaries of life in the stores of Monterey. Now this villainous habit of living upon tick has grown into Californian nature. I do not mean that the American and European storekeepers of Monterey are as lax as Mexicans. I mean that American farmers in many parts of the state expect unlimited credit and profit by it in the meanwhile without a thought for consequences. Jew storekeepers have already learned the advantage to be gained from this. They lead on the farmer into irretrievable indebtedness, and keep him ever after as their bond-slave, hopelessly grinding in the mill. So the whirligig of time brings in its revenges, and except that the Jew knows better than to foreclose, you may see Americans bound in the same chains with which they themselves had formerly bound the Mexican. It seems as if certain sorts of follies, like certain sorts of grain, were natural to the soil rather than to the race that holds and tills it for the moment. In the meantime, however, the Americans rule in Monterey County. The new county seat, Salinas City, in the bald corn-bearing plain under the Gabilano Peak, is a town of a purely American character. The land is held, for the most part, in those enormous tracts which are another legacy of Mexican days, and form the present chief danger and disgrace of California, and the holders are mostly of American or British birth. We have here in England no idea of the troubles and inconveniences which flow from the existence of these large landholders, land thieves, land sharks, or land grabbers. They are more commonly and plainly called. Thus the townlands of Monterey are all in the hands of a single man. How they came there is an obscure, vexatious question, and rightly or wrongly, the man is hated with a great hatred. His life has been repeatedly in danger. Not very long ago, I was told, the stage was stopped and examined 3 evenings in succession by disguised horsemen thirsting for his blood. A certain house on the Salinas Road, they say he always passes in his buggy at full speed, for the squatter sent him warning long ago, but a year since he was publicly pointed out for death by no less a man than Mr. Dennis Kearney. Kearney is a man too well known in California, but a word of explanation is required for English readers originally an Irish drayman. He rose, by his command of bad language, to almost dictatorial authority in the state, throned it there for 6 months, or so. His mouth full of oaths, gallowses, and conflagrations, was first snuffed out last winter by Mr. Coleman, backed by his San Francisco vigilantes and 3 Gatling guns, completed his own ruin by throwing in his lot with the grotesque Greenbacker party, and had at last to be rescued by his old enemies, the police, out of the hands of his rebellious followers. It was while he was at the top of his fortune that Kearney visited Monterey with his battle cry against Chinese labor, the railroad monopolists, and the land thieves, and his one articulate counsel to the Montereyans was to hang David Jacks. Had the town been American, in my private opinion, this would have been done years ago. Land is a subject on which there is no jesting in the West, and I have seen my friend the lawyer drive out of Monterey to adjust a competition of titles with the face of a captain going into battle, and his Smith & Wesson convenient to his hand. On the ranch of another of these landholders you may find our old friend, the truck system, in full operation. Men live there year in year out to cut timber for a nominal wage which is all consumed in supplies. The longer they remain in this desirable service, the deeper they will fall in debt, a burlesque injustice in a new country where labor should be precious, and one of those typical instances which explains the prevailing discontent and the success of the demagogue Kearney in a comparison between what was and what is in California. The praisers of times past will fix upon the Indians of Carmel. The valley drained by the river, so named, is a true Californian valley, bare, dotted with chaparral, overlooked by quaint, unfinished hills. The Carmel runs by many pleasant farms, a clear and shallow river, loved by wading keen, and at last, as it is falling towards a quicksand and the great Pacific, passes a ruined mission on a hill. From the mission church the eye embraces a great field of ocean, and the ear is filled with the continuous sound of distant breakers on the shore. But the day of the Jesuit has gone by, the day of the Yankee has succeeded, and there is no one left to care for the converted savage. The church is roofless and ruinous, sea breezes and sea fogs, and the alternation of the rain and sunshine, daily widening the breaches and casting the crockets from the wall. As an antiquity in this new land, a quaint specimen of missionary architecture, and a memorial of good deeds, it had a triple claim to preservation from all thinking people, but neglect and abuse have been its portion. There is no sign of American interference, save where a headboard has been torn from a grave to be a mark for pistol bullets. So it is with the Indians for whom it was erected. Their lands, I was told, are being yearly encroached upon by the neighboring American proprietor, and with that exception no man troubles his head for the Indians of Carmel. Only one day in the year, the day before our Guy Fawkes, the Padre drives over the hill from Monterey. The little sacristy, which is the only covered portion of the church, is filled with seats and decorated for the service. The Indians troop together, their bright dresses contrasting with their dark and melancholy faces, and there among a crowd of somewhat unsympathetic holiday-makers you may hear God served with perhaps more touching circumstances than in any other temple under heaven. An Indian, stone-blind and about 80 years of age, conducts the singing. Other Indians compose the choir, yet they have the Gregorian music at their finger ends, and pronounce the Latin so correctly that I could follow the meaning as they sang. The pronunciation was odd and nasal, the singing hurried and staccato. In secula, seculohohorum they went, with a vigorous aspirate to every additional syllable. I have never seen faces more vividly lit up with joy than the faces of these Indian singers. It was to them not only the worship of God, nor an act by which they recalled and commemorated better days, but was besides an exercise of culture where all they knew of art and letters was united and expressed, and it made a man's heart sorry for the good fathers of yore who had taught them to dig and to reap, to read and to sing, who had given them European mass books which they still preserve and study in their cottages, and who had now passed away from all authority and influence in that land, to be succeeded by greedy land thieves and sacrilegious pistol shots. So ugly a thing may our Anglo-Saxon Protestantism appear beside the doings of the Society of Jesus. But revolution in this world succeeds to revolution. All that I say in this paper is in Apollo past tense. The Monterey of last year exists no longer. A huge hotel has sprung up in the desert by the railway. 3 sets of diners sit down successively to table. Invaluable toilettes figure along the beach and between the live oaks, and Monterey is advertised in the newspapers and posted in the waiting rooms at railway stations as a resort for wealth and fashion. Alas for the little town, it is not strong enough to resist the influence of the flaunting caravanserai, and the poor, quaint, penniless native gentlemen of Monterey must perish, like a lower race, before the millionaire vulgarians of the big bonanza. Forest notes, idle hours, the woods by night, in all their uncanny effect, are not rightly to be understood until you can compare them with the woods by day. The stillness of the medium, the floor of glittering sand, these trees that go streaming up like monstrous seaweeds and waver in the moving winds like the weeds in submarine currents. All these set the mind working on the thought of what you may have seen off a foreland or over the side of a boat, and make you feel like a diver down in the quiet water fathoms below the tumbling, transitory surface of the sea. And yet in itself, as I say, the strangeness of these nocturnal solitudes is not to be felt fully without the sense of contrast. You must have risen in the morning and seen the woods as they are by day, kindled and colored in the sun's light. You must have felt the odor of innumerable trees at even the unsparing heat along the forest roads and the coolness of the groves. And on the first morning you will doubtless rise betimes. If you have not been wakened before by the visit of some adventurous pigeon, you will be wakened as soon as the sun can reach your window, for there are no blinds or shutters to keep him out, and the room, with its bare wood floor and bare whitewashed walls, shines all round you in a sort of glory of reflected lights. You may doze a while longer by snatches, or lie awake to study the charcoal men and dogs and horses with which former occupants have defiled the partitions, tiers with wily profile, local celebrities, pipe in hand, or maybe a romantic landscape splashed in oil. Meanwhile, artist after artist drops into the salle à manger for coffee, and then shoulders easel, sunshade, stool and paintbox, bound into a faggot, and sets off for what he calls his motive. And artist after artist, as he goes out of the village, carries with him a little following of dogs. For the dogs, who belong only nominally to any special master, hang about the gate of the forest all day long, and whenever anyone goes by who hits their fancy, profit by his escort and go forth with him to play an hour or two at hunting. They would like to be under the trees all day, but they cannot go alone. They require a pretext, and so they take the passing artist as an excuse to go into the woods, as they might take a walking stick as an excuse to bathe. With quick ears, long spines and bandy legs, or perhaps as tall as a greyhound, and with a bulldog's head, this company of mongrels will trot by your side all day, and come home with you at night, still showing white teeth and wagging stunted tail. Their good humour is not to be exhausted. You may pelt them with stones, if you please, and all they will do is to give you a wider berth. If once they come out with you, to you they will remain faithful, and with you return, although if you meet them next morning in the street, it is as like as not they will cut you with a countenance of brass. The forest, a strange thing for an Englishman, is very destitute of birds. This is no country where every patch of wood among the meadows gives up an incense of song, and every valley wandered through by a streamlet rings and reverberates from side to side with a profusion of clear notes, and this rarity of birds is not to be regretted on its own account only, for the insects prosper in their absence and become as one of the plagues of Egypt. Ants swarm in the hot sand, mosquitoes drone their nasal drone. Wherever the sun finds a hole in the roof of the forest, you see a myriad transparent creatures coming and going in the shaft of light, and even between whiles, even where there is no incursion of sun rays into the dark arcade of the wood, you are conscious of a continual drift of insects, an ebb and flow of infinitesimal living things between the trees. Nor are insects the only evil creatures that haunt the forest, for you may plump into a cave among the rocks and find yourself face to face with a wild boar, or see a crooked viper slither across the road. Perhaps you may set yourself down in the bay between two spreading beech roots with a book on your lap and be awakened all of a sudden by a friend. I say, just keep where you are, will you? You make the jolliest motive, and you reply, well, I don't mind if I may smoke. And thereafter the hours go idly by your friend. At the easel labors doggedly a little way off in the wide shadow of the tree, and yet farther across a strait of glaring sunshine you see another painter encamped in the shadow of another tree and up to his waist in the fern. You cannot watch your own effigy growing out of the white trunk, and the trunk beginning to stand forth from the rest of the wood, and the whole picture getting dappled over with the flecks of sun that slip through the leaves overhead, and as the wind goes by and sets the trees a-talking, flicker hither and thither like butterflies of light. But you know it is going forward, and out of emulation with the painter get ready your own palette and lay out the color for a woodland scene in words. Your tree stands in a hollow paved with fern and heather, set in a basin of low hills and scattered over with rocks and junipers. All the open is steeped in pitiless sunlight. Everything stands out as though it were cut in cardboard. Every color is strained into its highest key. The boulders are some of them upright and dead, like monolithic castles, some of them prone like sleeping cattle. The junipers, looking in their soiled and ragged mourning, like some funeral procession that has gone seeking the place of sepulture 300 years and more in wind and rain, are daubed in forcibly against the glowing ferns and heather. Every tassel of their rusty foliage is defined with pre-Raphaelite minuteness, and a sorry figure they make out there in the sun, like misbegotten yew trees. The scene is all pitched in a key of color so peculiar, and lit up with such a discharge of violent sunlight as a man might live 50 years in England and not see. Meanwhile, at your elbow, someone tunes up a song, words of Ronsard to a pathetic tremulous air, of how the poet loved his mistress long ago, and pressed on her the flight of time, and told her how white and quiet the dead lay under the stones, and how the boat dipped and pitched as the shades embarked for the passionless land. Yet a little while, sang the poet, and there shall be no more love, only to sit and remember loves that might have been. There is a falling flourish in the air that remains in the memory and comes back in incongruous places, on the seat of hansoms or in the warm bed at night, with something of a forest savour. "You can get up now," says the painter. "I'm at the background." And so up you get, stretching yourself, and go your way into the wood, the daylight becoming richer and more golden, and the shadows stretching further into the open. A cool air comes along the highways, and the scents awaken. The fir trees breathe abroad their ozone. Out of unknown thickets comes forth the soft, secret, aromatic odor of the woods, not like a smell of the free heaven, but as though court ladies, who had known these paths in ages long gone by, still walked in the summer evenings, and shed from their brocades a breath of musk or bergamot upon the woodland winds. One side of the long avenues is still kindled with the sun, the other is plunged in transparent shadow. Over the trees, the west begins to burn like a furnace, and the painters gather up their chattels and go down by avenue or footpath to the plain.